The French Revolution was not just a political upheaval, it was a complete transformation of society, a storm that swept away centuries of monarchy, privilege, and tradition. In the late 18th century, France was a nation divided. The wealthy nobility and clergy lived in opulence, while the majority, farmers, workers, and the urban poor, struggled under crushing taxes and rising bread prices. The Enlightenment had planted the seeds of change, spreading new ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But in 1789, those ideas exploded into action. From the storming of the Bastille to the cries of women marching on Versailles, the revolution shook the foundations of France. Kings were put on trial, the guillotine became a symbol of justice and terror, and ordinary citizens found themselves at the center of world-changing events. Across Europe, monarchs watched in fear as the revolutionaries dismantled the old order. This was not just the story of France, it was the story of how the common people claimed the power to shape their own destiny. But the path to freedom came with chaos, bloodshed, and the rise of a man who would crown himself emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. The revolution promised liberty, but what it delivered changed history forever. Before we dive into the drama of kings, queens, and revolutions, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a journey through history. The year was 1715. France was the largest, most populous, and arguably the most powerful country in Europe. Yet beneath its glittering surface, the seeds of upheaval had already been planted. That year, Louis XIV, the Sun King, breathed his last after ruling for 72 years. His reign had transformed France into a symbol of absolute monarchy, grand palaces, elaborate ceremonies, and centralized power in the hands of one man. But it also left the kingdom heavily in debt from costly wars and extravagant spending. When Louis XIV died, his great-grandson, a 5-year-old child, became King Louis XV. The nation was placed under the regency of Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. Initially, there was hope that the regent's more relaxed style might ease the burden on the people. Yet France's problems ran far deeper than court manners. The state finances were in shambles, with tax collection inefficient and corrupt. The nobility enjoyed immense privileges and paid almost no taxes, leaving the bulk of the burden on the peasantry and the emerging urban middle class. The first decades of Louis XV's reign were marked by a slow decline in royal authority. While the Sun King had been a master of projecting power, Louis XV seemed increasingly detached from governance, preferring leisure and the company of mistresses. Corruption at court became a public scandal. The people who once believed the king ruled by divine right began to murmur doubts about the monarchy's moral authority. In the countryside, peasants lived under harsh conditions. The vast majority of French people worked the land, yet owned little of it. They were obliged to pay tithes to the church, feudal dues to their landlords, and taxes to the crown, often leaving them with barely enough to survive. A bad harvest could mean starvation, and food shortages were frequent. In cities like Paris, artisans and laborers faced their own struggles: rising prices, stagnant wages, and overcrowding. Meanwhile, a new social force was emerging: the bourgeoisie or middle class. Merchants, professionals, and educated elites grew wealthier and more influential, yet they remained excluded from political power, which was monopolized by the nobility. This frustration simmered quietly but would later explode into revolutionary demands. Intellectually, the 18th century was the age of enlightenment, and France was its beating heart. Philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau questioned the foundations of monarchy, religion, and privilege. They championed reason, liberty, and equality, ideas that began to seep beyond the salons of Paris into the wider public consciousness. Printing presses spread pamphlets and books at unprecedented rates, eroding the control of church and crown over information. By mid-century, France's political and financial troubles deepened. Costly wars with Britain, especially the Seven Years' War (1756 to 1763), drained the treasury and humiliated France on the global stage. The loss of most of its colonial possessions in North America and India was a blow to national pride. The French navy, once feared, was weakened. Its armies were battered. The government's attempts to reform taxation and administration faced resistance from the nobility and the powerful parliaments, or high courts, which saw reforms as threats to their privileges. Louis XV's later years were clouded by scandal and growing unpopularity. His liaison with Madame du Barry, following the notorious reign of Madame de Pompadour, became fodder for gossip and criticism. Pamphleteers painted the king as morally corrupt and out of touch with his subjects. When Louis XV died in 1774, France's monarchy was already showing cracks. His successor, Louis XVI, inherited not only the throne but a crumbling financial system and a society restless for change. At just 20 years old, Louis was earnest but indecisive, more interested in hunting and locksmithing than the complexities of governance. His young Austrian-born queen Marie Antoinette soon became a lightning rod for criticism. Her lavish spending, foreign origins, and perceived indifference to the suffering of the people earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. Yet in these early years of Louis XVI's reign, there was still hope for reform. Finance ministers like Turgot and Necker proposed changes to modernize the economy and spread the tax burden more fairly. But entrenched privilege stood in the way. The nobility and clergy resisted, and the king lacked the political will to confront them decisively. The 1780s brought further trouble. France's support for the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, was a bold move to weaken Britain, its old rival. While the victory of the American colonists was celebrated, the war plunged France deeper into debt, over 2 billion livres. Interest payments consumed more than half of the government's revenue. Tax increases were met with resistance from every quarter, and borrowing could only delay the crisis. The social tensions grew sharper. Bad harvests in 1787 and 1788 caused bread prices to soar, leading to hunger and riots. For a population where bread made up most of the daily diet, scarcity was a direct threat to survival. The urban poor grew restless, the peasants resentful, and the middle class impatient for political change. By the eve of 1789, France was a kingdom in deep trouble. The monarchy's prestige had eroded, the economy teetered on collapse, and Enlightenment ideals had given the people a language to articulate their grievances. No single event caused the French Revolution. It was the accumulation of decades of inequality, mismanagement, and changing ideas. The seeds of revolution had been sown, and soon they would burst into a storm that would shake France and the world to its core. The death of Louis XIV in 1715 ushered in the regency of Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, until the young Louis XV came of age. While Louis XIV had left France militarily respected but financially crippled, the regency was marked by economic experiments and political uncertainties. John Law, a Scottish financier, convinced the regent to implement paper currency and established the Mississippi Company to manage colonial trade and national debt. At first, speculation soared and Paris seemed gripped by a new era of wealth. However, when the Mississippi bubble burst in 1720, thousands lost their fortunes, and public trust in financial reform crumbled. The collapse reinforced a deep skepticism of state-led economic schemes and sowed seeds of resentment toward the ruling elite, who were seen as shielded from the disaster. Louis XV took direct control in 1723, but his reign was marked by a gradual erosion of royal prestige. Initially popular and known as the Beloved, Louis XV's early victories in diplomacy and stability could not compensate for the growing impression that the monarchy was detached from the needs of ordinary people. Wars such as the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, drained France's treasury and diminished its international standing. The 7 Years' War in particular was a humiliating blow, costing France most of its overseas territories in North America and India. Many in France began to question whether the Bourbon monarchy had the competence to defend national interests. At home, the rigid social structure continued to weigh heavily on the Third Estate. The First Estate, made up of clergy, and the Second Estate, composed of nobles, enjoyed vast privileges. They were exempt from many taxes and had disproportionate political influence in provincial parliaments and court politics. Meanwhile, the Third Estate, the vast majority of the population, bore the heaviest tax burden, including the taille land tax, gabelle salt tax, and feudal dues. Even as agricultural productivity improved in certain regions, much of the rural peasantry lived on the brink of subsistence, vulnerable to bad harvests and rising grain prices. The Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual movement spreading across Europe, challenged these old structures. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau criticized absolute monarchy, championed individual liberties, and promoted ideas of equality before the law. In Parisian salons, the elite discussed new theories of governance, economics, and human rights. Pamphlets and books smuggled into France from abroad carried radical messages about democracy, secularism, and social reform. While these ideas were embraced by educated urban elites, they also filtered into provincial towns, influencing merchants, lawyers, and eventually politically active members of the Third Estate. Louis XV's personal scandals further eroded the monarchy's image. His relationships with mistresses such as Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry became symbols of court extravagance. Satirical pamphlets, known as libellous, portrayed the king as morally corrupt, spending lavishly on pleasures while his subjects struggled. Although Madame de Pompadour supported Enlightenment figures and reforms in the arts, her influence on royal politics was often criticized by conservative factions. The disconnect between Versailles and the people deepened, setting a tone of mistrust that would haunt Louis XVI. In the countryside, the system of feudal dues and tithes persisted, creating friction between peasants and their landlords. Many peasants were required to provide unpaid labor, known as the corvée, for road construction or other state projects. This was deeply resented, especially during years of poor harvest when survival itself became uncertain. Grain shortages, often worsened by speculative hoarding, could spark bread riots, foreshadowing the explosive role that bread prices would play in the revolution. By the 1770s, economic pressures were mounting. The cost of living was rising faster than wages, especially in urban centers like Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. Skilled artisans, known as sans-culottes for their working-class dress, were increasingly vocal in their grievances. They felt squeezed between the wealthy bourgeoisie who were gaining economic power and the entrenched nobility who maintained legal privileges. These tensions created fertile ground for radical political action. In foreign policy, France sought revenge for the humiliations of the 7 Years' War by supporting the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. While this alliance brought military prestige and the satisfaction of undermining Britain, it also massively increased France's debt. Ironically, French soldiers and officers who fought in America, including the Marquis de Lafayette, returned with first-hand experience of revolutionary ideals, further spreading Enlightenment principles at home. The ascension of Louis XVI in 1774 brought a glimmer of hope for reform. Young, earnest, and initially popular, Louis XVI appointed reform-minded ministers such as Turgot, who sought to modernize the economy by reducing feudal privileges, ending the corvée, and encouraging free trade in grain. But these reforms were met with fierce resistance from the privileged estates and were quickly abandoned. Later ministers, including Necker and Calonne, tried to stabilize the finances through new taxes on the nobility, but each attempt triggered political crises. By the late 1780s, France's financial system was on the verge of collapse. The monarchy could no longer secure loans without promising sweeping reforms. Years of deficit spending, a regressive tax system, and the enormous costs of war had created a fiscal deadlock. Meanwhile, a severe series of bad harvests in 1787 and 1788 caused bread prices to soar, leading to widespread hunger and unrest. Public opinion, shaped by decades of Enlightenment criticism, was no longer content with minor adjustments. The call for the Estates General in 1789, the first time the body had been summoned since 1614, was seen as a turning point. The Third Estate demanded equal representation and a meaningful voice in governance. What had begun as murmurs of discontent in the early 18th century had grown into a powerful tide of revolutionary sentiment. France stood on the brink of a political and social transformation that would shake the foundations of Europe. As the 18th century progressed, the contrast between the lavish lifestyle of the aristocracy and the struggles of ordinary citizens became more glaring. The nobility continued to enjoy privileges such as exemption from most taxes, while the peasantry bore the heaviest fiscal burdens. This inequity was reinforced by the rigid social structure of the Ancien regime, which offered little chance for upward mobility. Even wealthy members of the Third Estate, such as successful merchants and professionals, found themselves excluded from political influence due to their birth. Such restrictions fostered resentment among those who had the means and education to participate in governance but were denied the opportunity. The economic strain deepened as France's involvement in costly wars mounted. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was a particularly devastating conflict for France, ending in military defeat and the loss of valuable overseas colonies in North America and India. The war's expenses had drained the treasury, forcing the monarchy to borrow heavily and increase taxes on the already burdened commoners. Louis XV's government attempted some reforms, but resistance from the nobility and clergy stifled any meaningful changes. This inability to modernize the financial system left the kingdom in a precarious position. In the latter part of the century, France's support for the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, further worsened its financial crisis. While the victory against Britain brought prestige, it came at an enormous cost. The loans and military expenses added to an already staggering national debt. Ironically, the ideals of liberty and equality that French soldiers encountered in America inspired discussions about reform back home. Pamphlets and political writings began to circulate, encouraging people to question the existing order. The seeds of revolutionary thought were quietly taking root among intellectuals, reformers, and members of the bourgeoisie. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment was reaching its peak in France. Philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau challenged traditional notions of monarchy, religion, and governance. They promoted the concepts of separation of powers, freedom of speech, and the idea that sovereignty belonged to the people rather than a single ruler. The salons of Paris became hubs for debate, where men and women discussed bold ideas about human rights and the social contract. Though these ideas were often discussed in elite circles, their influence spread to a broader audience through books, newspapers, and pamphlets. The agricultural sector, which formed the backbone of France's economy, faced repeated challenges during this period. Poor harvests in the 1780s led to food shortages and sharp rises in bread prices, the staple diet of the French population. For many urban workers, bread accounted for the majority of daily expenses, so price increases could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Food riots occasionally broke out in cities, highlighting the growing desperation among the lower classes. The rural poor, burdened with feudal dues and tithes to the church, found little relief from their hardships. By the reign of Louis XVI, who ascended the throne in 1774, the situation had reached a critical point. Though the young king initially showed interest in reform, he lacked the decisiveness and political skill needed to overcome resistance from entrenched interests. His marriage to Marie Antoinette, an Austrian archduchess, became a point of public criticism. Many saw her as a foreign influence who spent extravagantly while the country suffered. Her lavish lifestyle and perceived indifference to the people's plight earned her the nickname, Madame Deficit. Efforts at financial reform under ministers like Turgot and Necker were short-lived. Proposals to reduce privileges for the nobility and clergy met with fierce opposition, leading to the dismissal of reform-minded advisors. Without structural changes, the government continued to accumulate debt. Attempts to introduce new taxes sparked protests, particularly when the Parliament of Paris, a powerful judicial body, refused to register the king's edicts. This created a political deadlock, as the monarchy struggled to assert its authority. By the late 1780s, France's fiscal crisis was undeniable. The state's credit had nearly collapsed, and lenders were increasingly reluctant to provide funds without assurances of reform. The king's decision to summon the Estates General in 1789, a representative assembly that had not met for over 170 years, was seen as a desperate measure to address the financial emergency. For many, it was also an opportunity to demand broader political and social changes. The rigid class divisions of the Ancien regime were being challenged, and the nation stood on the brink of profound transformation. The years leading up to 1789 were marked by growing discontent, political paralysis, and an economy in decline. The monarchy's inability to adapt to changing realities, combined with the spread of Enlightenment ideals, set the stage for a confrontation that would reshape France and reverberate across the world. The seeds of revolution had been sown in the fertile ground of inequality, debt, and the desire for a new social order, and soon, those seeds would burst into a storm that neither king nor court could control. In the spring of 1789, France found itself standing on the edge of dramatic change. The Estates General, which had not been called for more than 175 years, was convened by King Louis XVI to address the nation's growing financial crisis. For decades, royal spending, costly wars, and an inefficient tax system had drained the treasury. The privileged classes, the clergy and nobility, were largely exempt from taxes, leaving the burden to fall on the Third Estate, which represented the vast majority of the population. While the Estates General was initially seen as a forum for dialogue, it quickly became a battleground for France's future. The meeting of the Estates General brought together representatives from all three estates: the First Estate, made up of the clergy, the Second Estate, composed of the nobility, and the Third Estate, representing the common people. In theory, each estate had an equal voice, but in practice, the structure heavily favored the upper classes. Each estate voted as a bloc, meaning the First and Second Estates could outvote the Third Estate 2-1, regardless of the population imbalance. This outdated voting system frustrated the Third Estate, whose representatives came prepared to push for meaningful reform. From the beginning, tensions were high. The Third Estate, which included lawyers, merchants, and other educated individuals, brought with them the grievances of the common people: demands for fairer taxes, more political representation, and an end to feudal privileges. Pamphlets circulated in Paris and the provinces, many inspired by Enlightenment ideals, calling for equality before the law and greater accountability in government. The Abbé Sieyès, a prominent political thinker and clergyman, captured the growing sentiment in his famous pamphlet, "What is the Third Estate?" His answer was direct: everything. Sieyès argued that the Third Estate was the true backbone of the nation, producing its wealth and sustaining its society, yet it was treated as if it counted for nothing. As the Estates General sessions began at Versailles in May 1789, the initial ceremonies were steeped in tradition. The king presided in regal splendor, and the three estates processed in separate groups, reinforcing the divisions between them. Discussions soon revealed deep disagreements over how the assembly should conduct its business. The First and Second Estates wished to maintain the old method of voting by estate, which ensured their dominance, while the Third Estate insisted on voting by head, where each representative would have one vote, allowing the commoners a real chance at influence. Weeks passed without progress. The nobility and clergy resisted change, hoping to protect their privileges, while the Third Estate grew increasingly impatient. As debates stalled, the atmosphere became tense and mistrustful. Outside the palace, the situation in France was worsening. Bread prices were soaring, unemployment was rising, and unrest was spreading through towns and villages. The people's hope that the Estates General would deliver swift reform was fading. Inside the halls of Versailles, the Third Estate began to see that compromise with the other two estates was unlikely. On June 10, they took a bold step, inviting members of the First and Second Estates to join them in common deliberations. A small number of clergy accepted the invitation, but the majority of nobles refused. The king's ministers hesitated to intervene decisively, unsure whether to side with the reformers or defend the traditional order. By mid-June, the Third Estate decided to act on its own authority. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the sovereign will of the French people. This was a revolutionary act in itself. For the first time, an official body in France asserted that legitimate political authority did not come from the king alone but from the nation as a whole. The declaration sent shockwaves through the court. Supporters of the old regime saw it as a dangerous usurpation of royal power, while reformers celebrated it as a historic turning point. The king's response was cautious. While he did not immediately dissolve the assembly, he began planning measures to reassert control. Rumors circulated that he intended to close their meeting hall and force the deputies back into the traditional estate structure. This uncertainty only deepened the resolve of the National Assembly to continue its work. They understood that they were challenging centuries of monarchical authority, and that any retreat now would undermine the momentum for change. On June 20, their fears seemed to be confirmed. Arriving at their usual meeting place in Versailles, the deputies found the doors locked and guarded by soldiers. The official explanation was that the hall was being prepared for a royal session, but many suspected this was an attempt to disperse them. Unwilling to be silenced, the deputies searched for an alternative venue. They eventually gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court, a long rectangular building with high walls and a wooden floor. Here, under the heat of the summer sun and the eyes of curious onlookers, they made a solemn vow that would mark one of the most iconic moments of the French Revolution. They pledged not to separate until they had given France a new constitution. This was the tennis court oath, a statement of unity and determination that transcended the immediate disputes over procedure. It was a declaration that the authority of the people was above that of the monarch, and that the assembly would not rest until France had a fair and just political system. The deputies stood together, raising their hands in a collective gesture of solidarity, and the image of this moment would be immortalized in paintings and engravings that circulated widely in the years to come. The oath electrified France. In Paris, crowds gathered to hear the news and revolutionary fervor surged. The symbolism was clear. The representatives of the people had defied the king's attempt to control them, and they had done so with dignity and resolve. Even some members of the clergy and nobility, moved by the courage of the assembly, began to join their ranks. The political balance in Versailles was shifting rapidly, and the old order was starting to crack. In the spring of 1789, France found itself standing on the edge of dramatic change. The Estates General, which had not been called for more than 175 years, was convened by King Louis XVI to address the nation's growing financial crisis. For decades, royal spending, costly wars, and an inefficient tax system had drained the treasury. The privileged classes, the clergy and nobility, were largely exempt from taxes, leaving the burden to fall on the Third Estate, which represented the vast majority of the population. While the Estates General was initially seen as a forum for dialogue, it quickly became a battleground for France's future. The meeting of the Estates General brought together representatives from all three estates: the First Estate, made up of the clergy, the Second Estate, composed of the nobility, and the Third Estate, representing the common people. In theory, each estate had an equal voice, but in practice, the structure heavily favored the upper classes. Each estate voted as a bloc, meaning the First and Second Estates could outvote the Third Estate 2-1, regardless of the population imbalance. This outdated voting system frustrated the Third Estate, whose representatives came prepared to push for meaningful reform. From the beginning, tensions were high. The Third Estate, which included lawyers, merchants, and other educated individuals, brought with them the grievances of the common people: demands for fairer taxes, more political representation, and an end to feudal privileges. Pamphlets circulated in Paris and the provinces, many inspired by Enlightenment ideals, calling for equality before the law and greater accountability in government. The Abbé Sieyès, a prominent political thinker and clergyman, captured the growing sentiment in his famous pamphlet, "What is the Third Estate?" His answer was direct: everything. Sieyès argued that the Third Estate was the true backbone of the nation, producing its wealth and sustaining its society, yet it was treated as if it counted for nothing. As the Estates General sessions began at Versailles in May 1789, the initial ceremonies were steeped in tradition. The king presided in regal splendor, and the three estates processed in separate groups, reinforcing the divisions between them. Discussions soon revealed deep disagreements over how the assembly should conduct its business. The First and Second Estates wished to maintain the old method of voting by estate, which ensured their dominance, while the Third Estate insisted on voting by head, where each representative would have one vote, allowing the commoners a real chance at influence. Weeks passed without progress. The nobility and clergy resisted change, hoping to protect their privileges, while the Third Estate grew increasingly impatient. As debates stalled, the atmosphere became tense and mistrustful. Outside the palace, the situation in France was worsening. Bread prices were soaring, unemployment was rising, and unrest was spreading through towns and villages. The people's hope that the Estates General would deliver swift reform was fading. Inside the halls of Versailles, the Third Estate began to see that compromise with the other two estates was unlikely. On June 10, they took a bold step, inviting members of the First and Second Estates to join them in common deliberations. A small number of clergy accepted the invitation, but the majority of nobles refused. The king's ministers hesitated to intervene decisively, unsure whether to side with the reformers or defend the traditional order. By mid-June, the Third Estate decided to act on its own authority. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the sovereign will of the French people. This was a revolutionary act in itself. For the first time, an official body in France asserted that legitimate political authority did not come from the king alone but from the nation as a whole. The declaration sent shockwaves through the court. Supporters of the old regime saw it as a dangerous usurpation of royal power, while reformers celebrated it as a historic turning point. The king's response was cautious. While he did not immediately dissolve the assembly, he began planning measures to reassert control. Rumors circulated that he intended to close their meeting hall and force the deputies back into the traditional estate structure. This uncertainty only deepened the resolve of the National Assembly to continue its work. They understood that they were challenging centuries of monarchical authority, and that any retreat now would undermine the momentum for change. On June 20th, their fears seemed to be confirmed. Arriving at their usual meeting place in Versailles, the deputies found the doors locked and guarded by soldiers. The official explanation was that the hall was being prepared for a royal session, but many suspected this was an attempt to disperse them. Unwilling to be silenced, the deputies searched for an alternative venue. They eventually gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court, a long rectangular building with high walls and a wooden floor. Here, under the heat of the summer sun and the eyes of curious onlookers, they made a solemn vow that would mark one of the most iconic moments of the French Revolution. They pledged not to separate until they had given France a new constitution. This was the tennis court oath, a statement of unity and determination that transcended the immediate disputes over procedure. It was a declaration that the authority of the people was above that of the monarch, and that the assembly would not rest until France had a fair and just political system. The deputies stood together, raising their hands in a collective gesture of solidarity, and the image of this moment would be immortalized in paintings and engravings that circulated widely in the years to come. The oath electrified France. In Paris, crowds gathered to hear the news and revolutionary fervor surged. The symbolism was clear. The representatives of the people had defied the king's attempt to control them, and they had done so with dignity and resolve. Even some members of the clergy and nobility, moved by the courage of the assembly, began to join their ranks. The political balance in Versailles was shifting rapidly, and the old order was starting to crack. In the days following the tennis court oath, political maneuvering intensified. King Louis XVI, aware of the growing momentum behind the National Assembly, faced a difficult choice. If he openly opposed them, he risked inflaming public anger and triggering unrest in Paris, where bread shortages and unemployment had already created a volatile atmosphere. Yet if he accepted their legitimacy, it would mean conceding a significant share of his authority to a body that had declared itself the voice of the nation. Some of the king's advisers urged a hardline approach, suggesting that troops be brought to Versailles to disperse the deputies by force. Others recommended a strategy of conciliation, fearing that repression could push moderate reformers into alliance with more radical elements. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, was generally believed to favor a firm stance, while ministers such as Jacques Necker leaned toward compromise, hoping to avoid open confrontation. Meanwhile, the National Assembly continued to meet and debate, undeterred by uncertainty over the king's intentions. Their discussions moved beyond procedural matters to broader questions about the structure of government, the nature of representation, and the limits of royal authority. Deputies spoke passionately about the need for a written constitution that would guarantee the rights of citizens and establish clear boundaries for the exercise of power. Outside the political halls, the people of Paris followed these developments closely. Coffee houses, print shops, and public squares buzzed with conversation about the Assembly's defiance. Newspapers and pamphlets spread news of the tennis court oath, often portraying it as a heroic act in the face of monarchical oppression. This growing public awareness was a critical factor. The Assembly's legitimacy increasingly rested not just on its own claims but on the popular support it was building among ordinary French citizens. As June turned to July, the situation reached a critical point. The presence of royal troops in and around Paris was seen by many as a sign that the king was preparing to crush the movement. In the Assembly, some deputies feared that their safety was no longer guaranteed, and they debated whether to relocate to a more secure location. At the same time, the king summoned the three estates to a royal session, hoping to reassert his authority and restore order to the proceedings. When the session took place, Louis XVI offered some concessions, such as agreeing to reforms in taxation and the abolition of certain feudal privileges. However, he stopped short of recognizing the Assembly's claim to represent the entire nation. This partial approach satisfied neither side. For the deputies, the fundamental issue was not simply policy changes but the principle of national sovereignty. For the king, acknowledging the Assembly outright would mean undermining the traditional foundations of his rule. The standoff could not last indefinitely. The Assembly had gained a symbolic victory through the tennis court oath, but its future remained uncertain. Its members knew that the king still held the power to dissolve them by force, and that without continued public support, their claims might be dismissed as empty gestures. Yet they also sensed that the tide of history was turning in their favor. Each day that passed without royal suppression made it harder for the monarchy to reassert its old dominance. By early July, more members of the clergy and even a few nobles had crossed over to join the National Assembly, further weakening the king's position. The idea that the Assembly truly represented France was gaining ground, not only among reformers but also in the minds of many ordinary citizens. The tennis court oath had transformed the political landscape. What began as a dispute over voting procedures had become a direct challenge to the absolute authority of the monarchy. The summer heat of 1789 seemed to mirror the intensity of the political atmosphere. After the tennis court oath, the National Assembly's position became increasingly bold, but it was still fragile. The king had not yet openly recognized their authority, and every move they made was being watched closely by the court. The royal family, their advisors, and conservative members of the First and Second Estates were deeply concerned that France was slipping into dangerous territory. For them, the very notion that authority came from the people rather than from the monarch was revolutionary and unacceptable. Versailles, normally a place of controlled ceremony and royal grandeur, now felt tense and uncertain. Rumors circulated constantly. Some claimed that the king intended to call in more troops, others that he was considering arresting the leaders of the assembly. There were also whispers that certain deputies might be persuaded to abandon their position if offered titles or positions of influence. In this climate of suspicion, trust between the crown and the assembly eroded further. The king's decision to station additional regiments near Paris and Versailles did little to calm the situation. Officially, these troops were brought in to maintain order, but many saw their presence as a clear warning to the National Assembly. The sight of armed soldiers on the streets sent a message. The monarchy still had the means to enforce its will. For the people of Paris, the military buildup was alarming. The memory of the tennis court oath was fresh, and any move against the assembly was likely to be viewed as an attack on the people's will. Within the assembly, debates grew more urgent. Deputies realized that their survival as a political body depended on maintaining the support of the people. They discussed how best to communicate their intentions to the broader public and how to respond if the king attempted to dissolve them by force. Moderates urged patience and negotiation, hoping to avoid bloodshed, while more radical voices argued that the monarchy could not be trusted and that decisive action was needed to secure the revolution's gains. Events in Paris began to take on a life of their own. Bread shortages were reaching critical levels, and unemployment was rising sharply. Crowds gathered in marketplaces and on street corners to discuss the latest news from Versailles. Many Parisians were already sympathetic to the National Assembly, and the possibility that the king might try to crush it inflamed their anger. Radical political clubs, such as the Jacobins, took advantage of the growing unrest to spread revolutionary ideas and call for vigilance against royal plots. The dismissal of Jacques Necker on July 11, 1789, was the spark that turned suspicion into open fury. Necker, the king's popular finance minister, was widely seen as a supporter of moderate reform and a figure willing to work with the assembly. His removal was interpreted by the public as a sign that the king had chosen confrontation over compromise. Crowds in Paris erupted in protest, fearing that Necker's dismissal would be followed by a crackdown on the assembly and the movement for reform. The next 2 days saw Paris transform into a city on the edge of revolt. Demonstrations spread, and confrontations between civilians and soldiers became more frequent. In cafés and political clubs, speeches urged citizens to defend their rights and to prepare for action if the king moved against the assembly. The call for arms began to circulate, with people seizing whatever weapons they could find. The city's atmosphere was charged with a mixture of fear, determination, and anticipation. Back in Versailles, the assembly continued its work despite the tension. Deputies understood that their actions had set in motion a process that could not easily be reversed. The constitution they sought to create was no longer just a political document. It was becoming a symbol of national sovereignty. Every article they debated and every clause they drafted carried the weight of a people's demand for representation. The knowledge that events in Paris were escalating only reinforced the urgency of their mission. The king, caught between conflicting advice, hesitated. Some urged him to crush the assembly before it could gain more strength, while others warned that such a move would provoke outright rebellion. His indecision allowed the situation to spiral further out of control. In the streets of Paris, militias began to form, and attention turned to the Bastille, a medieval fortress and prison that had come to symbolize royal tyranny. Although this event lay just ahead, its roots were firmly planted in the weeks of political struggle and mistrust that followed the tennis court oath. By mid-July, the National Assembly had survived its most immediate threat. The combination of public support, growing numbers within its ranks, and the king's reluctance to use force allowed it to continue its work. Yet the tension was far from over. The symbolic victory of the tennis court oath had been followed by a dangerous reality, a monarchy that still held the means to fight back, a restless public ready to take to the streets, and a political order that was crumbling with each passing day. The significance of the tennis court oath was now undeniable. It had transformed a procedural dispute into a national confrontation, giving the revolution its first unifying act of defiance. For the deputies, it was a moment that validated their belief in the sovereignty of the people. For the king and his allies, it was a sign that their authority was being challenged in a way that could not easily be reversed. In the weeks ahead, the momentum built in that cramped tennis court would help carry France toward the dramatic events that would define the revolution's early phase, including the fall of the Bastille and the reshaping of the political order. The atmosphere in Paris in early July 1789 was tense, charged with uncertainty, and on the brink of open revolt. For weeks, the political struggle between King Louis XVI and the newly formed National Assembly had been escalating. The dismissal of Jacques Necker on July 11 was the breaking point. Necker, the king's finance minister, had been widely respected by the people and seen as sympathetic to reform. His removal was interpreted not as a routine political decision but as a sign that the king had chosen to reject compromise. Rumors spread rapidly that Necker's dismissal was the first step in a larger plan to crush the assembly by force. In Paris, these rumors collided with existing economic distress. Bread prices had reached record highs, unemployment was widespread, and the urban poor were restless. The presence of royal troops near the city, many of them foreign regiments loyal to the crown, was seen as a direct threat. Crowds began to form in public squares, where fiery speeches denounced the monarchy's actions and called for resistance. The Palais Royal, a known hub of political agitation, became the epicenter of these gatherings. Camille Desmoulins, a young lawyer and passionate revolutionary, stood on a table and urged the crowd to take up arms, warning them that the king's soldiers would soon march on Paris. His words ignited a surge of energy. The call to arms quickly became a reality. Citizens began searching for weapons, storming gunsmith shops and raiding armories. The Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital and veterans' home, was looted for muskets and ammunition. However, one crucial element was missing: gunpowder. Everyone knew where to find it. The Bastille, an old fortress prison on the eastern edge of Paris, held not only prisoners but also a large supply of gunpowder and weapons. The Bastille was no ordinary building. Constructed in the late 14th century as part of the city's defenses, it had evolved into a state prison and a symbol of royal authority. Its massive stone walls, towers, and moat gave it an imposing presence. Though it held only a handful of prisoners in 1789, most of them petty criminals or political detainees, it was widely regarded as a place of tyranny, where the king could imprison anyone without trial. To the people of Paris, attacking the Bastille would be more than a practical mission for arms. It would be a symbolic strike against despotism. On the morning of July 14, crowds gathered around the fortress. Negotiations began between the people and the governor of the Bastille, Bernard-René de Launay. The citizens demanded the surrender of the garrison, the removal of the cannons, and the release of the gunpowder. Launay stalled, unsure whether to fight or yield. The garrison was small, about 100 soldiers, many of them veterans, and they had limited supplies. Still, the Bastille's defenses were formidable, and the governor knew that a direct assault would cost lives. By late morning, the tension had reached breaking point. Shots were fired, accounts differ on who fired first, and the crowd erupted. Fighting broke out in the narrow streets surrounding the fortress. The citizens were poorly armed, but their numbers swelled as more Parisians heard the news and rushed to the scene. The attackers used whatever they had: muskets seized from the Hôtel des Invalides, pikes, axes, and makeshift ladders. Some climbed onto rooftops to fire down at the defenders, while others hacked at the chains of the drawbridge. The siege dragged on for hours in the sweltering July heat. Smoke filled the air as cannon fire and musket shots echoed through the city. The defenders, realizing they could not hold out indefinitely, eventually raised a white flag. Launay agreed to surrender on the promise that he and his men would be spared. But the fury of the crowd could not be contained. As the gates were opened, the people surged inside, seizing the gunpowder and freeing the few prisoners held there. Launay was captured, and despite attempts to protect him, he was killed by the mob. His head was placed on a pike and paraded through the streets, a grim symbol of the day's events. The fall of the Bastille was more than a local uprising. It was a decisive moment in the French Revolution. Word spread rapidly across Paris and beyond, carried by messengers, newspapers, and excited witnesses. The fortress that had stood as a symbol of royal power was now in the hands of the people. The event sent shockwaves through France. In the capital, the mood shifted instantly from fear to celebration. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and the tricolor cockade, blue, white, and red, became the emblem of the revolution. King Louis XVI, upon hearing the news, reportedly asked whether it was a revolt. He was told, "No, sire, it is a revolution." The storming of the Bastille forced the monarchy to confront a new reality. The people of Paris were no longer passive subjects but active participants in shaping the nation's future. The king's authority had been directly challenged and found vulnerable. In the days that followed, Paris began to reorganize itself. A new municipal government was formed, and the National Guard, a citizen militia commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, was established to maintain order and defend the revolution. The presence of the Guard reassured many that the gains of July 14 would be protected. The Bastille itself was dismantled piece by piece, its stones sold as souvenirs or used in public works. It was as if the people were not just tearing down a building but dismantling the old order it represented. The symbolism of the Bastille's fall extended far beyond its walls. Across France, communities interpreted the event as proof that the monarchy could be challenged and defeated. The king's reliance on force had been met with force, and the people had prevailed. Political clubs and assemblies drew inspiration from the victory, and calls for reform grew louder. The storming of the Bastille marked the point at which the revolution moved from negotiation to action, setting the stage for even greater upheaval. Yet, as the celebrations continued, an undercurrent of uncertainty remained. The violence of the day had shown that the revolution could be fierce and uncontrollable. Moderates worried that the excesses might undermine the movement's legitimacy, while radicals saw it as a necessary demonstration of the people's power. Paris was united in triumph, but divisions over how to proceed were already beginning to form. The fall of the Bastille was only the beginning. Its immediate impact would be felt in the reorganization of Paris and the strengthening of the National Assembly, but its long-term consequences would unfold in the countryside, where fear and rumor would soon spark another wave of revolutionary action. The Great Fear, as it came to be known, would spread from village to village, driven by a combination of real events and imagined threats. What had started as an uprising in the capital was about to become a nationwide movement, reshaping every corner of France. The news of the Bastille's fall traveled swiftly through Paris, carried by word of mouth, hastily written broadsheets, and the excited shouts of messengers rushing through the streets. For the people of Paris, the day's events were more than just a violent uprising. They were a triumph against tyranny, a moment when ordinary citizens had proven that they could stand against the might of the crown. Crowds gathered in squares and marketplaces to hear the details repeated again and again: how the citizens had fought, how the fortress had fallen, and how the governor's head had been paraded as proof of victory. In every retelling, the heroism of the crowd grew, and the day began to take on the shape of legend even before the smoke had cleared. The authorities in Versailles were stunned. Louis XVI, who had spent the morning hunting and was reportedly unaware of the gravity of the situation, was told of the Bastille's capture later that evening. His reaction was said to be one of disbelief, as if he could not imagine that such a symbol of royal authority could be taken by force. Ministers and courtiers reacted with a mix of fear and confusion, knowing that the political balance in France had shifted dramatically in just a few hours. In the capital, royal troops withdrew from key positions, unwilling to face the same fury that had brought down the Bastille. The king, who only days earlier had seemed ready to reassert his authority through force, now found himself compelled to take a more conciliatory approach. In Paris, the political structure began to change almost immediately. The electors of Paris, who had initially been assembled to oversee the selection of deputies for the Estates General, transformed themselves into a new governing body, the Commune of Paris. They began to take control of the city's administration, replacing royal officials with men who enjoyed the trust of the people. To maintain order, and to ensure that the gains of the revolution would be defended, they organized the National Guard, a citizen militia commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of the American Revolutionary War. The Guard's tricolor cockade of blue, white, and red soon became a powerful symbol of the revolution, worn proudly by citizens across the city. The fall of the Bastille also marked a turning point in the psychology of the revolution. The king's aura of invincibility had been shattered, and the idea that sovereignty could rest in the hands of the people began to take root more firmly. Newspapers, pamphlets, and political clubs seized upon the moment to argue for further reforms, and revolutionary leaders recognized the opportunity to press for deeper changes to France's political and social structure. The atmosphere in Paris was electric, both jubilant and tense, as everyone understood that the events of July 14 were only the beginning. In the days that followed, the National Assembly found itself under increased pressure to act decisively. Deputies who had been wavering now saw that the people of Paris were not only willing to support the Assembly's calls for reform but were ready to take matters into their own hands. The balance of power between the Crown and the Assembly had shifted toward the latter, yet the situation remained precarious. The king had not yet agreed to the Assembly's demands, and the threat of counter-revolution was still very real. Many nobles fled the capital in fear, some leaving the country entirely in what became known as the first wave of émigrés. Beyond Paris, the news of the Bastille's fall spread rapidly into the provinces. In towns and cities across France, celebrations erupted as people heard that the Parisian crowd had defied royal authority. Municipal governments were challenged or replaced, local militias were formed, and the revolutionary fervor began to take hold far from the capital. Yet the spread of revolutionary spirit was not without its darker side. The same fears and anxieties that had driven Parisians to storm the Bastille now began to manifest in rural France, where rumors of aristocratic plots to starve the population or crush the revolution fueled unrest. The countryside was already tense in the summer of 1789. Poor harvests in the preceding years had left many peasants struggling to feed their families, and the rising cost of bread in the spring and summer had pushed them to the brink. The breakdown of central authority after the events in Paris only heightened the sense of uncertainty. In some regions, peasants began to attack symbols of seigneurial authority, burning manor houses, destroying feudal records, and refusing to pay dues. These disturbances, which would come to be known collectively as the Great Fear, were driven by a potent mix of economic hardship, political hope, and deep-seated resentment toward the privileges of the nobility. The Great Fear was not a coordinated uprising but rather a series of local revolts, each sparked by its own mix of circumstances and rumors. In some areas, word spread that foreign troops were marching toward the villages to suppress the revolution. In others, it was said that bands of brigands hired by nobles were raiding the countryside. These stories, though often unfounded, were believed because they aligned with the peasants' long-standing grievances and recent experiences of hardship. Villagers armed themselves, formed patrols, and sometimes attacked before they could be attacked. The targets were often the estates of local lords, where archives containing records of feudal obligations were sought out and destroyed. The destruction of feudal records was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it erased the documentation that gave legal force to the dues and obligations peasants were required to pay. Symbolically, it represented the rejection of a centuries-old system of privilege that had defined rural life in France. For many peasants, this was the real beginning of their liberation, the moment when they no longer recognized the authority of the nobility over their lives. In the eyes of the nobility, however, it was a terrifying collapse of order, one that threatened their very survival. As the Great Fear spread from region to region, the National Assembly in Paris realized that the unrest could not be ignored. Deputies were inundated with reports of rural violence, and many feared that if the situation continued unchecked, it could undermine the revolution itself. While some members of the Assembly sympathized with the peasants' grievances, others were alarmed at the scale of lawlessness. Yet the political momentum of the revolution meant that the Assembly could not simply call for a return to the old order. Instead, it began to consider how to address the peasants' demands in a way that would restore order while advancing the cause of reform. The debates in the Assembly during late July and early August were intense. Moderates sought a measured approach that would calm the countryside without alienating the nobility, while more radical deputies pushed for sweeping changes to the feudal system. The fear that the unrest might spread to urban centers, or even spark a broader civil war, added urgency to the discussions. In the end, it was clear that the Assembly would have to make a historic decision, one that could either solidify the revolution or plunge the country into chaos. As the news of the Bastille's fall rippled outward from Paris, it seemed to ignite the tinderbox of anxieties that had been smoldering in rural France for years. In the weeks following July 14, 1789, the countryside experienced an extraordinary wave of unrest, known to history as La Grande Peur, the Great Fear. It was not a single uprising in one region but a sudden, almost simultaneous outbreak of panic and revolt across much of the kingdom. This fear did not emerge in a vacuum. For months, rumors had been swirling in market towns, village squares, and parish churches. Whispers of aristocratic plots to crush the revolution, of foreign mercenaries marching to restore royal authority, of brigands roaming the fields to destroy harvests. In a society where communication relied on travelers, gossip, and the occasional pamphlet, such rumors spread with astonishing speed, each retelling amplifying the alarm. The social and economic context made the rural population especially susceptible to such fears. The poor harvest of 1788 had left many peasants on the edge of starvation, and the grain shortages of early 1789 had sharpened resentment towards landlords and grain merchants, who were often suspected of hoarding food to drive up prices. The political crisis in Paris, while thrilling to some, was unsettling to others who depended on stability to survive. When the Bastille fell, it was interpreted in villages far from the capital as a sign that the old order was collapsing and that violence could spread anywhere at any moment. The peasants did not merely imagine danger, they prepared to act against it. One of the most persistent rumors was that nobles had hired gangs of armed men to roam the countryside, burn crops, and punish communities that supported reform. In some places, these bands were said to be foreign mercenaries, perhaps Germans or Swiss, brought in by reactionary aristocrats. In others, the alleged attackers were local bandits, emboldened by the chaos in Paris. The stories varied, but the effect was the same: widespread panic and a readiness to take up arms. Villagers organized patrols, rang church bells to warn of supposed raiders, and in many cases, confronted travelers who appeared suspicious. The great fear quickly moved beyond defensive measures. In dozens of provinces, peasants began attacking the symbols and structures of feudal authority. They stormed chateaux, not merely to loot but to destroy the seigneurial archives, the collections of documents that recorded their obligations to pay dues and render services to their lords. To a peasant living under the weight of feudal rents and corvée labor, burning these parchments was a revolutionary act. It was the physical annihilation of the legal evidence that bound them to centuries-old exploitation. In many cases, the destruction was accompanied by demands for the abolition of tithes, hunting rights reserved to nobles, and other privileges that had long been resented. Although the violence varied in intensity from region to region, it followed a general pattern. In some places, the confrontation was almost ritualized. Villagers would gather, march to the lord's estate, present their grievances, and insist on the surrender of feudal records. If the lord complied, the mob would disperse without bloodshed. In others, resistance from the nobility led to more serious clashes, resulting in injuries or deaths. While these incidents did not amount to a coordinated national rebellion, they revealed a deep unity of sentiment among rural communities. Across vast distances, peasants were acting on similar fears, targeting the same symbols and making comparable demands. For the nobility, the great fear was a shocking revelation of their vulnerability. Estates that had stood for centuries as imposing centers of local power were suddenly subject to the will of the rural poor. Many aristocrats fled to the safety of larger towns or even left France altogether, joining the growing wave of émigrés who would later lobby European courts to intervene against the revolution. The countryside's upheaval also put immense pressure on the National Assembly in Paris. Having declared itself the representative of the people, the Assembly could not ignore the grievances that the peasants were now expressing through direct action. Within the Assembly, the events of the Great Fear sparked intense debates. Moderate reformers worried that unchecked rural violence would alienate potential allies among the upper classes and provoke a backlash that could endanger the fragile revolutionary movement. More radical members argued that the peasants' actions were a legitimate expression of popular will and that their demands for an end to feudal privileges were both just and necessary. The urgency of the situation, however, left little time for abstract discussion. Reports from the provinces described chaos, with lords appealing for protection and peasants insisting they would no longer recognize old obligations. The decisive moment came in the night session of August 4, 1789, one of the most dramatic in the Assembly's history. Under the combined pressure of rural unrest and the fear of national disintegration, noble deputies began to stand and voluntarily renounce their feudal rights. Some did so reluctantly, recognizing that the political cost of resisting was too high. Others spoke with genuine enthusiasm, presenting their gestures as sacrifices for the unity of the nation. Over the course of the night, the Assembly decreed the abolition of feudalism, sweeping away centuries of privilege in a single session. Hunting rights, manorial courts, tithes, and personal servitude were among the institutions declared ended. While the practical details of compensation and enforcement would take months to sort out, the symbolic impact was immediate. This was a turning point in the revolution. The abolition of feudal privileges transformed the relationship between the countryside and the revolutionary government. For the peasants, it was a vindication of their actions during the Great Fear, proof that the assembly recognized their grievances. For the nobles, it was a devastating loss of traditional authority and economic advantage. The transformation was not purely harmonious. Disputes over compensation and the precise meaning of the decrees would continue, but the principle that all Frenchmen were equal before the law had been asserted in a concrete, irreversible way. The Great Fear also altered the revolution's trajectory in another sense. The fall of the Bastille had been a symbolic blow against tyranny in the heart of Paris. The abolition of feudalism was a practical revolution in the daily lives of millions. It extended the revolution beyond the capital, ensuring that the changes underway would not be confined to the political elite but would reshape the economic and social foundations of France. This broad base of support would be vital in sustaining the revolutionary cause in the turbulent years to come. By the end of the summer of 1789, the initial phase of the revolution had entered a new stage. The people of Paris had shown that they could challenge royal authority directly. The peasants of the countryside had demonstrated that they could dismantle the remnants of feudalism. The National Assembly had begun to legislate for a new France, one in which the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity would be tested in the crucible of real social change. Yet the forces that had been unleashed were unpredictable, and the revolution's course was far from settled. The storming of the Bastille and the Great Fear had set the stage for a period of hope, fear, and unrelenting political struggle that would define the next decade of French history. After the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, France stood at the threshold of transformation. The National Assembly, which had risen from the defiance of the Third Estate, now positioned itself as the legitimate voice of the French people. Yet legitimacy was fragile. The old structures of the Ancien regime had not yet collapsed entirely, and the monarchy still existed, albeit weakened. Peasants and urban workers were restless, noble privileges were increasingly challenged, and fear of counter-revolution haunted the streets of Paris. The Assembly understood that beyond drafting a constitution, it needed a clear and compelling statement of the principles that would guide the new France, a symbolic and legal foundation for a just society. This urgency gave birth to the idea of a Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The concept of such a declaration was not new. Philosophers of the Enlightenment had long argued for natural rights, those belonging to all human beings by virtue of their existence, rather than granted by a ruler. Montesquieu's separation of powers, Rousseau's social contract, and Voltaire's defense of freedom of expression formed the intellectual backbone of the Assembly's debates. Across the Atlantic, the American Declaration of Independence, 1776, and the Virginia Declaration of Rights, 1776, had provided living examples of how revolutionary principles could be crystallized into a formal statement. Many deputies in the Assembly saw these precedents as proof that liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty were not mere philosophical dreams but practical political foundations. From the outset, the task of drafting the Declaration was tied to broader constitutional work. Some members argued that rights should be declared before writing a constitution, ensuring that all laws would be subordinate to these core principles. Others feared that an abstract list of rights might encourage unrest if people interpreted them in extreme or unrealistic ways. The debate was not only about content but also about timing and purpose. Figures like Lafayette, who had served in the American War of Independence, pushed strongly for the Declaration, drawing on his transatlantic experience. He even sought the counsel of Thomas Jefferson, then serving as the American minister to France, in shaping the language. In late July 1789, committees began working on drafts. Proposals came from various quarters. Some were short and concise, others lengthy and philosophical. The differences reflected not only personal styles but also political positions. Moderates sought a document that would assert basic freedoms while preserving a constitutional monarchy. Radicals envisioned a declaration that would fundamentally redefine the relationship between citizen and state. The challenge was to reconcile these visions into a statement that could unite the nation in principle, even if disagreements remained over its practical implementation. Outside the Assembly, public expectations grew. Pamphlets circulated demanding that rights be recognized and abuses of the old regime abolished once and for all. The press, now enjoying relative freedom, published passionate essays calling for equality before the law, the end of feudal dues and protections against arbitrary imprisonment. Popular political clubs, especially in Paris, made the declaration a central demand. For many ordinary citizens, such a document would be more than political theory, it would be a promise that the revolution was truly theirs. The debates in the National Assembly intensified as the deputies worked line by line to refine the draft of the declaration. Some members argued passionately that property should be declared an inviolable and sacred right, seeing it as a cornerstone of personal liberty. Others, more radical, feared that such a clause would protect the privileges of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Ultimately, the wording chosen sought to balance these competing views, affirming property as a right, but also allowing for public necessity to require its use, provided just compensation was given. This careful compromise reflected the Assembly's awareness that the revolution's ideals had to appeal to all classes, from the smallholder farmer to the urban merchant, while still keeping the trust of those with economic power. At the same time, the deputies were aware of the pressing political situation outside their chambers. Paris remained restless, with crowds eager to see tangible signs of progress. Pamphleteers and newspaper editors followed the debates closely, reporting each phrase and amendment to an increasingly politicized public. The sense that the declaration was not merely an abstract legal text but a revolutionary weapon in the hands of the people lent urgency to every decision. It was clear to the Assembly that this document would not only guide the framing of laws but also inspire action, both within France and beyond its borders. In the minds of many, they were writing a universal creed for humanity, one that would transcend the immediate crisis of 1789. When the final draft was completed in late August, the document contained 17 concise articles. These articles distilled the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity into clear, forceful language. They affirmed that sovereignty resided in the nation, that laws were the expression of the general will, and that no person could be accused, arrested, or detained except as prescribed by law. Freedom of speech and the press were declared essential, though subject to responsibility for abuses. Religious toleration was upheld, marking a decisive break from the Catholic monopoly on public worship. Each of these provisions represented a direct challenge to the old structures of privilege and absolute authority that had defined the Ancien regime for centuries. When the declaration was publicly read, it was met with widespread enthusiasm in revolutionary circles. The Parisian crowds cheered it as a triumph of reason and justice, while provincial towns received copies that were posted in public squares. The language of the declaration resonated far beyond the political elite. Artisans, laborers, and small shopkeepers began to see themselves as active participants in shaping their nation's destiny. Even those who could not read often heard its provisions recited aloud in marketplaces and clubs, giving the principles a kind of oral authority that spread quickly through the streets and countryside. However, not all reactions were positive. Monarchists and conservatives saw the declaration as dangerously subversive. To them, the assertion that all men were born free and equal in rights threatened the natural hierarchy that upheld the monarchy and the church. Some members of the nobility feared that the ideas enshrined in the document would fuel social upheaval and attacks on property. The clergy, particularly the higher ranks, were unsettled by the guarantee of religious freedom, which seemed to undermine the Catholic Church's privileged position in French society. These tensions foreshadowed the conflicts that would emerge in the coming years, as revolutionary ideals clashed with entrenched interests. Internationally, the declaration began to attract attention as well. In neighboring states, rulers and ministers read it with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Enlightenment thinkers in Britain, the German states, and Italy praised its philosophical clarity, while conservative commentators warned that it could spark dangerous unrest in their own countries. Across the Atlantic, Americans recognized echoes of their own Declaration of Independence, and some viewed it as a validation of their struggle. Others, particularly those still loyal to Britain, saw it as proof of the instability that could follow revolutionary change. This early wave of foreign reaction hinted at the declaration's potential to influence political discourse far beyond France's borders. The announcement of the declaration on August 26, 1789, marked a defining moment in the French Revolution. It was not simply a reform document, it was a radical reimagining of the relationship between the state and its citizens. The National Assembly adopted it as a preamble to a future constitution, and in doing so, signaled to the French people and to the world that the revolution was not just about removing an unpopular king but about establishing an entirely new social and political order. Its principles challenged centuries of feudal privilege and monarchical absolutism. For many, it was a beacon of hope. For others, particularly the monarchy and aristocracy, it was a direct threat to their very existence. The declaration's articles were brief, yet they carried immense weight. They spoke of liberty as the natural right of every human being, defined freedom as the ability to do anything that does not harm others, and affirmed that law could only prohibit actions harmful to society. This was a clear break from the idea that rights were privileges granted by a ruler. Now, rights were seen as inherent and inalienable. Equality was declared not in vague terms, but explicitly. Every man was equal before the law, with no exemptions based on birth or social rank. Taxes were to be distributed equitably, proportionate to each person's means, ending centuries of noble and clerical tax exemptions. These ideas were revolutionary not only for France but for the entire Western world. The document also addressed the sovereignty of the nation. It proclaimed that political authority originated from the people, not from divine right or hereditary claim. The concept of popular sovereignty had been discussed by philosophers like Rousseau, but here it was given legislative force. It stated that no group or individual could exercise authority that did not explicitly emanate from the nation. This assertion threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. By declaring that the law was an expression of the general will, the assembly was binding all future governance to the principles of collective decision-making. Freedom of speech and of the press were also enshrined as fundamental rights, with the caveat that individuals were responsible for any abuse of these freedoms under the law. This provision recognized that public discourse was essential to a functioning democracy. It was a direct rejection of the strict censorship that had existed under the Ancien regime, where criticism of the king could lead to imprisonment without trial. The protection of property rights was another central element. While the revolution sought to dismantle feudal privileges, it also safeguarded personal ownership, ensuring that no one could be deprived of their property except for public necessity and with fair compensation. This reflected the influence of Enlightenment economic thinkers who saw property as a pillar of personal liberty. Religious freedom, though not as explicitly stated as in later documents, was implied through the emphasis on liberty of opinion. In a country where the Catholic Church had long dominated spiritual and political life, this was a subtle yet significant shift. The Declaration effectively separated the concept of citizenship from religious affiliation, moving France toward secular governance. The document's language was intentionally universal. It spoke of men, in a way that suggested these rights were not just for French citizens, but for all humanity. This universalism was inspiring but also controversial, as it raised questions about the application of these rights to women, enslaved people in French colonies, and other marginalized groups. Figures like Olympe de Gouges would soon challenge the Assembly on these exclusions. Despite its lofty ideals, the Declaration was not universally accepted at once. Many conservatives, both within France and abroad, viewed it as dangerously radical. Edmund Burke, in his famous critique of the French Revolution, argued that abstract declarations of rights were impractical and destabilizing. Monarchists feared that such principles would erode all hierarchy and order, leading to anarchy. Even some revolutionaries worried that these rights might embolden the common people to demand more than the Assembly was prepared to give. But the document's adoption solidified the revolution's ideological foundation. It became a rallying point for those who believed that France could become a society based on justice, equality, and rational governance. The influence of the American Revolution on the Declaration was undeniable. Lafayette, who had fought alongside George Washington, worked closely with Thomas Jefferson in drafting the document. The American Declaration of Independence and state constitutions had already articulated many of these rights, but the French version carried a more universal and philosophical tone, reflecting the Enlightenment heritage of Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. The transatlantic exchange of ideas during this period reinforced the belief that liberty and equality were not just political options but moral imperatives. After its adoption, the Declaration began to shape French law and society. The National Assembly used it as a guiding framework while drafting the Constitution of 1791. The abolition of feudalism, the reform of taxation, and the restructuring of the judiciary all reflected its principles. However, applying these rights in practice was far more challenging than proclaiming them. Economic inequality persisted, and political rights were initially limited to active citizens, who paid a certain amount in taxes, excluding a large portion of the population. Moreover, the ongoing financial crisis and political instability often forced the Assembly to balance ideals with urgent practical needs. Internationally, the Declaration inspired both admiration and fear. Revolutionary clubs in other countries distributed translations, fueling reform movements across Europe and Latin America. At the same time, monarchies saw it as a dangerous contagion. The spread of these ideas contributed to the eventual wars between revolutionary France and various European coalitions. The Declaration's assertion that sovereignty resided in the nation resonated with oppressed peoples, but it also challenged the legitimacy of every hereditary ruler in Europe. Over time, the Declaration became more than a political statement, it became a symbol of the revolution itself. Even as France descended into the more radical and violent phases of 1792 to 1794, the principles outlined in August 1789 remained a reference point. Later French constitutions would incorporate its language, and its ideals would influence the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its legacy is a reminder that while political systems may rise and fall, the idea that every person possesses inherent rights remains enduring. Yet the Declaration was not without contradictions. While it spoke of liberty and equality, the reality in 1789 was that women, the poor, and enslaved people were excluded from its full benefits. In the French colonies, slavery persisted until 1794 and was later reinstated by Napoleon. Women, despite playing a crucial role in the revolution, remained politically disenfranchised. Critics have argued that the Declaration's universality was more aspirational than actual. Nevertheless, it planted the seeds for future struggles for civil rights and equality. The adoption of the Declaration marked a turning point where the revolution shifted from dismantling the old regime to constructing a new order. It gave the revolution a moral and philosophical compass, one that would guide not only France but also inspire movements worldwide. In the turbulent years that followed, its words would be invoked by revolutionaries, reformers, and idealists, each interpreting its meaning in their own context. While the political landscape of France would change repeatedly, from monarchy to republic to empire and back again, the principles first articulated in 1789 would remain a cornerstone of French political identity. By October 1789, the optimism and unity that had characterized the early days of the French Revolution were beginning to show signs of strain. Paris was still restless. Food shortages persisted, bread prices remained painfully high, and rumors swirled through the crowded streets and markets. The harvest had been poor, and supplies of grain were inconsistent, leading to hunger among the city's working-class population. The political situation was tense. The National Assembly was busy drafting laws and debating the restructuring of France, but for the ordinary people of Paris, talk of constitutions mattered far less than the price of bread. The revolution, for many, would only be meaningful if it could put food on their tables. Women were at the heart of this daily struggle. In 18th-century France, women were often the ones responsible for purchasing bread for their families. They endured the long waits at bakeries, argued with merchants, and felt the sting of hunger when they returned home empty-handed. This made them particularly sensitive to food shortages and more inclined to take action when their family's survival was at stake. By the autumn of 1789, frustration was turning into anger, and anger was threatening to spill into open protest. The immediate spark came in early October. Rumors spread that, at a lavish banquet held at Versailles, officers of the royal bodyguard had insulted the tricolor cockade, the red, white, and blue badge worn by supporters of the revolution. The officers were said to have trampled the cockade underfoot, replacing it with the white cockade of the Bourbons. Whether this story was true or exaggerated mattered little. It enraged the people of Paris. To them, it symbolized the king's indifference and the aristocracy's contempt for the revolution. Combined with ongoing bread shortages, this rumor pushed public outrage to a boiling point. On the morning of October 5, 1789, the tension broke. It began almost spontaneously at the Paris markets. Women, many of them fishmongers and market workers, began shouting about the lack of bread and calling on others to march to Versailles. They wanted to confront the king directly and demand action. At first, the crowd numbered only a few hundred, but as the hours passed, it grew larger. Women armed themselves with whatever they could find, sticks, knives, and pikes, and some even dragged cannons with them. The atmosphere was a mix of desperation, determination, and raw energy. The women set off on foot for Versailles, a grueling 20-kilometer journey in the autumn rain. Along the way they picked up more supporters, including men sympathetic to their cause, soldiers from the National Guard, and curious onlookers. Their ranks swelled into the thousands. News of the march raced ahead to Versailles, where the court was stunned by the scale and speed of the movement. The royal family, still living in relative isolation, had not fully grasped how deeply discontent had spread. When the crowd reached Versailles that afternoon, the women flooded into the Assembly's meeting hall, soaking wet and covered in mud. They demanded bread and insisted on speaking to the king. Their presence was a shock to the deputies, who were unused to such direct and forceful demands from commoners, let alone from women. Some deputies tried to calm them, promising to address their grievances, but the marchers were determined to meet Louis XVI himself. By the evening, the situation had grown more complicated. Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, arrived at Versailles with several thousand of his men. He had not wanted to let the armed crowd march unaccompanied, but he also recognized that trying to stop them could lead to bloodshed. His task now was to maintain order and prevent violence between the marchers, the National Guard and the king's troops. That night, tensions at Versailles reached a dangerous level. Many marchers camped outside in the palace courtyard, shivering in the cold and rain but unwilling to leave without results. Inside the palace, the king reluctantly agreed to meet a delegation of women. He listened to their complaints, promised to distribute bread from the royal stores, and even agreed to travel to Paris, but the atmosphere remained charged. The marchers wanted more than promises. They wanted action they could see and trust. The women's march to Versailles had begun as a desperate plea for bread, but as they approached the palace gates, their purpose evolved into something far more significant. The women's chants grew louder, their demands clearer: bread, justice, and the king's accountability. The Paris National Guard, led by Lafayette, followed behind, caught between maintaining order and not provoking the crowd. By the time they reached Versailles, the sheer number of marchers was staggering, a living wave of Paris's frustration. Palace guards watched nervously from behind the ornate gates, recognizing that this was not an ordinary disturbance. The assembly, still in session nearby, quickly realized the urgency of the moment as the crowd swelled outside. Deputies looked from the chamber windows to see a sight that had never occurred before in French history: thousands of common citizens, mostly women, surrounding the palace that had long symbolized royal grandeur and untouchable authority. The women were drenched from the rain, their clothes clinging to them, mud clinging to their skirts, yet they stood resolute in the palace courtyard. Many shouted for the king to appear, while others demanded to see Marie Antoinette, whose name was often mentioned in angry mutters. Versailles, with its gleaming marble and gold, stood in stark contrast to the gaunt faces and thin bodies pressing against its gates. Lafayette, upon arrival, faced the difficult task of keeping the crowd calm while convincing the king to respond. Inside, King Louis XVI was informed of the situation and at first hesitated, uncertain whether to address the crowd directly. But the pressure was immense, and soon he appeared on a balcony to speak. His words, promising bread and attention to their grievances, momentarily calmed the crowd. The king also agreed to meet a small delegation of women inside, where they described their suffering in detail, speaking with the blunt honesty of hunger. As night fell, the mood outside remained tense. Many of the women had no intention of returning to Paris without concrete results. The palace guards were on edge, fully aware that any spark could set off chaos. In the early hours of the morning, a commotion erupted as a group of marchers forced their way into the palace. The intrusion was chaotic: doors smashed open, guards pushed aside. In the fray, 2 guards were killed, and their heads were displayed on pikes, a grim reminder of Paris's growing radicalism. Marie Antoinette, awakened by the noise, was rushed to safety by her attendants. Eventually, she appeared on a balcony alongside her children, but at the crowd's demand she returned alone, standing in the open as thousands of eyes fixed on her. The gesture was bold and dangerous, yet it won her a momentary silence from the crowd. Many bowed instinctively, though the hostility toward her remained strong. Lafayette, recognizing the danger of prolonging the standoff, urged the king to make a decisive move. The solution was dramatic. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their children would leave Versailles and return to Paris with the crowd. By late morning, the royal carriage was prepared, and the king stepped out to join the marchers. It was no grand procession, it was a symbolic act of submission. As the royal family's carriage rolled slowly toward Paris, the women marched alongside, carts of flour leading the way. Some sang songs of triumph, others jeered at the monarchs, but all knew this was a historic moment. The king was no longer a distant ruler in a palace. He was now in the hands of the people. When the procession finally reached Paris, the king and his family were escorted to the Tuileries Palace, which would become their gilded prison. The women who had begun the march in desperation returned with a sense of accomplishment. They had not only secured bread but had physically brought the monarchy into the heart of revolutionary Paris. The march on Versailles had begun as a simple cry for food but ended as a political earthquake, marking the beginning of the king's gradual loss of power and the people's growing sense of their own strength. From that day onward, the streets of Paris knew that collective action could change the fate of a nation. As the crowd began its return journey from Versailles to Paris, the early morning air was heavy with rain and the sound of countless feet trudging along the muddy road. The march back was unlike the frantic journey from Paris to Versailles. Now, the women and men moved with a sense of grim satisfaction, their mission accomplished. They had brought the king back to Paris, not as a ruler in full command of his realm, but as a figure watched closely by the people. The procession was slow and deliberate, a show of popular strength. Some pushed carts loaded with flour from Versailles stores, others carried loaves of bread high like trophies. Soldiers walked alongside, not in confrontation but as part of the crowd, a reflection of the new relationship between the people and certain regiments of the army. The king, queen, and royal family followed in a carriage surrounded by National Guardsmen. Lafayette himself rode near them, ensuring their safe passage but also making it clear that they were under escort, not traveling freely. The people called out in a mixture of mockery and triumph, shouting slogans like, "The baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy." A cutting reminder of the monarchy's perceived responsibility for providing bread to its subjects. Some were openly hostile, jeering at the queen in particular, whose reputation for extravagance had made her a target of resentment. Others were quieter, observing the moment with a sense of awe. For centuries, the monarchy had been distant, untouchable. Now it was moving through the streets of Paris under the will of the people. When the caravan reached Paris, the royal family was taken to the Tuileries Palace, a former royal residence but not nearly as grand as Versailles. It was close to the heart of the city, and thus close to the people, and to the revolutionary forces. This relocation was more than symbolic. It shifted the center of political gravity from Versailles to Paris. The National Assembly, still meeting in Versailles, would soon follow. The capital became not only the hub of revolutionary activity but also the place where the monarchy could be directly monitored, influenced, and, if necessary, coerced. In the days that followed, Paris buzzed with energy and uncertainty. Many saw the king's move as a victory for the revolution, a sign that the people could shape the destiny of France through direct action. The mood was celebratory for some, especially among the market women and poorer Parisians who felt they had struck a decisive blow against royal privilege. But others were uneasy. Bringing the king into Paris meant that he was effectively a prisoner of the revolution, a condition that could push him toward more desperate measures. For moderates like Lafayette, it was essential to maintain order and prevent further radicalism. Yet for the more militant revolutionaries, the relocation was just the beginning of dismantling the old order. The events of the march also marked a turning point in the role of women in the revolution. Their leadership in organizing and carrying out such a significant act demonstrated the power of ordinary citizens, especially women of the working class, in shaping political events. These were not courtly aristocratic women influencing policy behind the scenes, but market women, housewives, and laborers taking to the streets, confronting soldiers, and directly engaging with the king and queen. Their demands were not abstract political theories but concrete needs: bread, fair prices, and the right to live without hunger. In doing so, they connected the high ideals of liberty and equality with the everyday struggles of survival. For the monarchy, the March on Versailles was a humiliating blow. Louis XVI had attempted to maintain an image of paternal authority, but the spectacle of being escorted to Paris by a crowd of citizens undermined that image. Marie Antoinette, already unpopular, became even more of a political lightning rod. The Queen's supposed defiance during the balcony scene, whether interpreted as bravery or arrogance, continued to circulate in revolutionary newspapers, shaping public opinion against her. The Palace of Versailles, once a symbol of absolute power, now stood largely empty, a monument to a vanishing era. Internationally, news of the march spread rapidly, shocking other monarchies. The idea that a royal family could be compelled by force to abandon its residence and live under the watch of common citizens was almost unthinkable. It sent ripples of fear through the courts of Europe, where rulers began to realize that the revolutionary spirit could cross borders. At the same time, some foreign observers saw the march as proof of the people's strength and as a model for political change. Back in Paris, the political landscape shifted quickly. The presence of the king in the city gave the National Assembly an unprecedented opportunity to influence royal decisions. It also created a tense new dynamic in which any sign of the king's resistance or disloyalty could provoke an immediate response from the people. This proximity between ruler and ruled was both a safeguard against royal counter-revolution and a constant source of potential conflict. The March on Versailles also had lasting effects on the strategies of revolutionary leaders. It demonstrated that spontaneous mass action, driven by necessity and anger, could achieve results that formal petitions and debates could not. While some feared the potential for mob violence, others saw the crowd as the true engine of the revolution. In the years to come, this lesson would be repeated in more dramatic and violent forms. As winter approached, bread shortages persisted and political tensions deepened. But the people of Paris now had the king within reach, and that fact alone changed everything. The revolution was no longer a distant movement unfolding in legislative halls. It was a daily reality present in the streets, the markets, and the very walls of the Tuileries. The march had brought the monarchy into the heart of the revolutionary storm, and there would be no turning back. By 1790, the French Revolution had already dismantled much of the old regime's political and social framework. The National Assembly, dominated by reform-minded deputies, had pushed through major legislative changes, including the abolition of feudal privileges, the end of noble tax exemptions, and the formal adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Yet the monarchy still existed, and King Louis XVI continued to hold a central place in the nation's governance, at least in theory. This uneasy coexistence between revolutionary reform and royal authority created an ongoing tension that would define the next phase of events. Many hoped to preserve the monarchy but in a radically restructured form, a constitutional monarchy where the king would act within limits defined by law and by the elected representatives of the people. The idea of constitutional monarchy was inspired in part by the British system, where the monarch's powers were restrained by parliament and the rule of law. French moderates saw this as a potential model for stability, believing it could satisfy both traditionalists who valued the crown and revolutionaries seeking popular sovereignty. The National Assembly set about drafting a constitution that would codify these principles. However, even as they worked, deep divisions persisted. On one side were constitutional monarchists like Lafayette, Bailly, and Mirabeau, who sought compromise with the king. On the other side were more radical elements who doubted Louis's sincerity and suspected him of plotting to restore absolute power. The debates within the assembly were intense, as deputies argued over the nature of legislative power, the role of the king in foreign affairs, and the extent of popular participation in governance. Throughout 1790 and into 1791, the assembly undertook the monumental task of reorganizing France's political institutions. It created a system of departments, districts, and communes to replace the old provincial divisions, ensuring that local administration was more uniform and accountable. This administrative overhaul was meant to break the power of regional aristocratic elites and bring government closer to the people. The assembly also took steps to nationalize the Catholic Church's property and bring its operations under state control, through the civil constitution of the clergy. This reform sparked intense controversy, as priests were required to swear loyalty to the new regime, splitting the clergy between those who took the oath and those who refused. The resulting religious conflict would deepen the political crisis in the months ahead. Meanwhile, the court at the Tuileries Palace struggled to adjust to its diminished status. Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette maintained a public facade of cooperation, but privately they resented the erosion of royal authority and sought ways to reverse it. Secret correspondence with foreign monarchs and exiled nobles hinted at a counter-revolutionary agenda. This duplicity fueled suspicion among revolutionaries, who began to view the monarchy as an obstacle rather than a partner in reform. The people of Paris, always sensitive to signs of betrayal, grew increasingly hostile toward the royal family, whose lavish lifestyle seemed out of touch with the economic hardships facing ordinary citizens. Economic conditions remained precarious despite the reforms. Inflation, food shortages, and unemployment persisted, and many Parisians believed the king and his allies were to blame for the slow pace of improvement. Popular demonstrations continued, with crowds gathering outside the Tuileries to demand action. The assembly, mindful of public opinion, accelerated its constitutional work in hopes of producing a document that would stabilize the nation. The proposed constitution would establish a single legislative assembly elected by a system of property-based suffrage, limiting full political participation to active citizens, men who paid a certain level of taxes. The king would retain a suspensive veto, allowing him to delay but not permanently block legislation, and he would control foreign policy and the military, though under legislative oversight. This arrangement was meant to balance power, but it satisfied neither side completely. Radicals objected to limiting the vote to wealthier citizens, arguing that sovereignty should belong to all men. Royalists, meanwhile, saw the king's powers reduced to a shadow of their former scope and considered this an unacceptable humiliation. The tensions inherent in this compromise were apparent even before the constitution was finished, and events outside the assembly soon brought matters to a head. The most dramatic turning point came in June 1791 with the king's attempted escape from Paris. Louis XVI, increasingly convinced that he could not work with the revolution, planned to flee with his family to the eastern frontier, where royalist forces and foreign allies could offer protection. Disguised and traveling under false papers, the royal party made it as far as the town of Varennes before being recognized and arrested. The flight to Varennes shocked the nation. It confirmed the suspicions of those who believed the king was conspiring against the revolution and destroyed much of the remaining trust between Louis and the people. Crowds greeted the royal family's return to Paris in silence and with thinly veiled hostility. The Varennes incident forced the Assembly to confront the question of the monarchy's future more urgently than ever. Some deputies called for the king's abdication or trial, while others, wary of plunging France into full republicanism, sought to salvage the constitutional project. In the end, the Assembly opted for a compromise. The king would be formally reinstated but bound even more tightly by constitutional limits. However, the damage was done. The monarchy's legitimacy had been gravely weakened, and the path toward a stable constitutional order was now strewn with obstacles. By the summer of 1791, the final stages of drafting the Constitution were underway. The Assembly continued to refine its provisions for the separation of powers, the judicial system, and local administration. It also defined the rights and duties of citizens, drawing directly from the principles enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The finished document, completed in September, proclaimed France a constitutional monarchy, with sovereignty residing in the nation and the king serving as its executive authority. On paper, it was a bold experiment in balancing tradition and innovation, monarchy and democracy. In practice, it would be tested almost immediately by the volatile political climate, the mistrust between factions, and the looming threat of foreign intervention. The political momentum in the National Assembly was increasingly driven by a belief that the revolution must now consolidate its gains and establish a stable framework for governance. This required balancing the ideals of liberty and equality with the practical realities of ruling a country still deeply divided in its loyalties. Many deputies believed that retaining a constitutional monarchy would provide the necessary stability, serving as a compromise between the revolutionary ideals and the long-established traditions of French governance. They envisioned a system where the king would remain as a symbolic figurehead, while real power resided in elected representatives who would create laws on behalf of the people. This approach seemed to promise both continuity and change, preventing the chaos that some feared might follow a complete abolition of the monarchy. The drafting of the Constitution became the central task, and the debates in the Assembly grew intense. Central to the process was defining the scope of the king's powers and the rights of the citizens. Many revolutionaries were wary of granting the monarch too much authority, fearing that it could enable a return to absolutism. On the other hand, some moderates insisted that the crown needed sufficient power to maintain order, manage foreign relations and oversee the military. The final compromise granted the king a suspensive veto, allowing him to delay legislation but not permanently block it. This provision reflected the Assembly's desire to respect the royal institution while ensuring that sovereignty ultimately rested with the people. Meanwhile, the economic crisis that had partly triggered the revolution was far from resolved. Food prices remained high, and unemployment in urban areas persisted. Inflation and shortages continued to fuel public discontent, making it clear that political reform alone could not address the underlying social and economic problems. The National Assembly attempted to stabilize the situation by reforming the tax system, introducing more equitable measures that placed a heavier burden on the wealthy. These reforms were meant to dismantle the privileges of the nobility and clergy, ensuring that all citizens contributed to the state's finances. However, implementing these changes proved challenging, as resistance from certain elites persisted, and administrative inefficiencies slowed progress. The civil constitution of the clergy, passed in 1790, further complicated the political landscape. This law reorganized the Catholic Church in France, bringing it under state control and requiring clergy to swear an oath of loyalty to the nation. While intended to create a more rational and democratic church structure, the measure deeply alienated many devout Catholics who viewed it as an attack on their faith. In rural areas especially, resentment toward the revolution began to grow, fueled by religious tensions. The king himself, a devout Catholic, was visibly uncomfortable with the policy, and his reluctance to endorse it fully made many revolutionaries doubt his commitment to the new constitutional order. Louis XVI's hesitation and lack of enthusiasm for the constitutional monarchy created a persistent atmosphere of mistrust. Although he publicly accepted the new framework, privately he and Queen Marie Antoinette sought ways to undermine it. Their secret correspondence with foreign monarchs and émigré nobles indicated their hope for foreign intervention to restore full royal authority. These suspicions were not yet proven, but the growing gap between the king's public image and private intentions eroded confidence in his role as a unifying figure. This mistrust became particularly dangerous as France's international situation became more precarious. The political clubs of Paris, such as the Jacobins and the Cordeliers, were becoming increasingly influential in shaping public opinion. These groups debated not only the future of the monarchy but also broader questions of equality, representation, and justice. Radical voices within these circles began to argue that even a constitutional monarchy was incompatible with the principles of the revolution. They called for the complete abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. While still a minority view in 1790 and early 1791, these ideas were gaining traction, especially among the urban working classes who felt that the revolution had not yet delivered on its promises. Outside Paris, reactions to the constitutional changes were mixed. Some regions embraced the reforms enthusiastically, seeing them as a long-overdue correction to centuries of inequality. Others, particularly in conservative rural areas, resisted them, clinging to the old order out of loyalty to the king, the church, or simply a fear of rapid change. This uneven acceptance of the new system foreshadowed the deep internal divisions that would later erupt into open conflict. The National Assembly also addressed the issue of France's colonial empire, particularly the question of slavery in the Caribbean colonies. Pressure from abolitionist groups clashed with fierce resistance from colonial planters who depended on slave labor for their economic survival. In 1791, the Assembly granted limited rights to free men of color but stopped short of abolishing slavery, a decision that left both abolitionists and colonists dissatisfied. These unresolved tensions would eventually explode into revolutionary uprisings in the colonies, particularly in Saint-Domingue, the richest of France's overseas possessions. By early 1791, the constitution was nearing completion. The framework established a unicameral legislature, elected by active citizens, men who met certain property and tax qualifications. While this expanded political participation beyond the narrow confines of the Ancien regime, it still excluded large portions of the population, including women, the poor, and enslaved people in the colonies. Advocates of universal male suffrage argued that the revolution's ideals demanded broader inclusion, but their calls were overridden by moderates who feared instability from too much political change too quickly. The ceremonial acceptance of the Constitution by Louis XVI in September 1791 was presented as a moment of national unity. Public celebrations were held, and official speeches hailed the dawn of a new era in which monarchy and liberty would coexist in harmony. Yet beneath the surface, the fractures in French society remained. Many revolutionaries doubted the king's sincerity, suspecting that he would seize any opportunity to restore his former powers. Meanwhile, economic hardship, religious conflict, and the growing radicalization of political discourse ensured that the revolution was far from over. What had been envisioned as a stable compromise between tradition and change was already showing signs of strain, setting the stage for further turmoil in the years to come. In the months after the king's acceptance of the Constitution, the Assembly worked to further implement reforms that would solidify the new constitutional monarchy. One important step was the establishment of a new legal system. The outdated patchwork of feudal laws was replaced with a unified system, and courts were restructured to ensure fairness and accessibility. Judges were to be elected rather than appointed by royal favor, which was a radical change aimed at reducing corruption and aristocratic dominance. The legal equality guaranteed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen began to take concrete shape in daily life, though in practice, old habits and prejudices were slow to fade. However, political divisions remained intense. The Assembly was divided into factions, Feuillants, Jacobins and others, each with their own vision of the monarchy's role. The Feuillants, composed largely of moderates, sought to preserve the king's position and prevent further radical change, believing that a stable constitutional monarchy would provide the best balance of order and liberty. The Jacobins, initially moderate, began to shift toward republicanism, arguing that the monarchy could not be trusted to protect the revolution's gains. These differences created a tense atmosphere in the Assembly, with debates often turning heated and personal. Outside the Assembly, the mood in the streets was shifting. While some Parisians cautiously welcomed the new system, many were skeptical, believing that the king's acceptance of constitutional limits was merely a tactical move. The radical press played a significant role in shaping this perception, publishing articles and pamphlets accusing Louis XVI of conspiring with foreign monarchies to restore his full powers. Figures like Jean-Paul Marat and Camille Desmoulins stoked public distrust, and political clubs such as the Cordeliers and Jacobins attracted growing membership from the urban poor. Economic conditions also tested the stability of the constitutional monarchy. Inflation continued, food prices remained high, and unemployment was still a problem in urban centers. These hardships fueled resentment toward both the monarchy and the assembly, as people felt their immediate needs were being overshadowed by political debates. Strikes and demonstrations became more frequent, and even those who had supported the revolution from the beginning began to wonder whether real change was possible under a constitutional king. By 1791, events outside France were also influencing domestic politics. Many aristocrats who had fled the country, the émigrés, were lobbying foreign powers to intervene and restore the king's authority. Their activities, combined with rumors of secret correspondence between the royal family and foreign courts, deepened suspicion. The growing threat of foreign intervention made the revolutionaries more determined to limit the king's influence over the army and foreign policy. The constitution gave these powers primarily to the assembly, further reducing the monarch's role in governance. Meanwhile, the king himself was increasingly unhappy with his restricted role. Although he outwardly complied with the constitution, in private he and Queen Marie Antoinette expressed their frustration and continued to look for ways to restore full royal authority. This tension reached a critical point in June 1791, when the royal family attempted to flee Paris in what became known as the Flight to Varennes. Though this dramatic event would occur after the official establishment of the constitutional monarchy, its seeds were sown in the frustration and mistrust of this period. In summary, the creation of the constitutional monarchy marked a major milestone in the French Revolution, but it was not a period of peace and stability. The gap between revolutionary ideals and political reality remained wide, and the survival of the monarchy depended on mutual trust between the king and the people, a trust that was rapidly eroding. The next phase of the revolution would see whether this fragile experiment in shared power could withstand the pressures from within and beyond France's borders. By late 1791, the French Revolution had transformed France from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional one. But the uneasy arrangement between King Louis XVI and the revolutionary government was collapsing. The failed flight to Varennes in June 1791 had deeply damaged the king's reputation and fueled suspicions that he was conspiring with foreign monarchies to restore his power. Although Louis had publicly accepted the new constitution, his behavior suggested reluctance and even covert resistance. Revolutionary leaders, especially in the Jacobin and Cordeliers clubs, viewed him as a traitor in waiting. Across Europe, other monarchs watched with alarm, and counter-revolutionary émigrés gathered in exile, calling for armed intervention to save the French crown. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria, partly as a preemptive strike against perceived foreign threats and partly as an attempt to rally national unity. But the war went poorly in its early stages, and defeats on the front lines fueled fears of treason at home. The king's dismissal of pro-war ministers and his vetoes of key revolutionary measures convinced many that he was actively sabotaging the revolution. Tensions exploded on August 10, 1792, when insurgents stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards were massacred, and the royal family barely escaped with their lives, seeking refuge in the Legislative Assembly. This uprising effectively ended the monarchy, and on September 21, 1792, the newly elected National Convention formally abolished it, declaring France a republic. The abolition of the monarchy raised the pressing question of what to do with Louis XVI, now referred to as Citizen Louis Capet. While moderates in the Girondin faction urged caution and feared executing the king would provoke foreign powers into war, radicals in the Jacobin camp saw him as a living symbol of tyranny whose survival threatened the revolution's legitimacy. In November 1792, hidden documents were discovered in an iron chest in the Tuileries, revealing secret correspondence between Louis and foreign powers, which confirmed suspicions of treason. The evidence hardened public opinion against him. Many in Paris demanded not just his removal but his death, seeing it as necessary for the security of the Republic. On December 11, 1792, Louis XVI was brought before the National Convention to stand trial. The trial was unprecedented. Never before had a reigning or former king of France been tried by the people's representatives. Louis appeared calm and dignified, dressed simply, but his fate was being decided in a courtroom that was both a legal chamber and a political theater. The charges against him included conspiring with foreign enemies, betraying the nation and attempting to restore absolute monarchy. The prosecution argued that the king was not above the law and that his crimes were crimes against the sovereignty of the people. Louis's defense team, led by Raymond d'Assise, argued that the king had acted within his constitutional rights until the monarchy was abolished, that he could not be judged retroactively for acts committed while he was sovereign, and that the trial was inherently illegal. Louis himself remained mostly silent during the proceedings, answering questions briefly and politely. He denied conspiring against the French people and claimed he had only sought to preserve order and prevent bloodshed. Yet the mood in Paris and among many deputies had already shifted decisively toward condemnation. Outside the courtroom, angry crowds demanded justice, and revolutionary newspapers portrayed the king as a monster. The debates within the convention were intense and bitter. Girondins worried that execution would set a dangerous precedent and alienate potential allies in the provinces, while Jacobins led by Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton insisted that mercy would signal weakness and invite more treason. The revolution, they argued, could not truly live while the king did. The trial dragged on into January 1793, with deputies giving long speeches for or against the king's life. It became clear that this was not only a trial of Louis XVI but also a defining moment for the revolution itself, whether it would compromise or take the radical path of irrevocable break with monarchy. The trial and execution of King Louis XVI marked one of the most dramatic and symbolic moments of the French Revolution, a turning point that transformed the struggle from a political movement seeking reform into a radical republic willing to execute its own monarch. After the failed flight to Varennes in June 1791, the king's credibility had been severely damaged. Although the constitutional monarchy was maintained for a time, the king was increasingly viewed by many revolutionaries as a traitor to the nation. His perceived collusion with foreign monarchies and his hesitation in fully embracing the revolution's reforms fueled suspicions. By August 1792, the situation had reached a breaking point. The storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10 led to the suspension of the monarchy and the imprisonment of the royal family. The Legislative Assembly dissolved itself, and the newly elected National Convention declared France a republic on September 21, 1792. The question of what to do with the deposed king quickly became a pressing and divisive issue. The convention, dominated by the radical Jacobins but still containing moderate Girondins, debated whether Louis should be judged at all. The radicals argued that Louis XVI had already been judged by the people through the revolution itself and that his fate should be sealed without legal proceedings. The moderates insisted on a formal trial, fearing that an extrajudicial execution would appear as mob justice and undermine the legitimacy of the new government. Ultimately, a trial was agreed upon, both to give an appearance of legality and to publicly present evidence of the king's alleged crimes. The charges against Louis were grave: conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, collusion with foreign powers, and attempts to overthrow the constitution. The discovery of the armoire de fer, iron chest, in the Tuileries, containing secret correspondence that showed his communications with counter-revolutionary elements, provided damning proof. The trial began on December 11, 1792, with Louis brought before the convention. Addressed as Louis Capet, a symbolic rejection of his royal title, he was questioned about his actions during the revolution. Louis maintained a calm and dignified demeanor, defending his intentions and claiming he had always acted in the best interest of France. His defense, led by Raymond d'Assise along with two other lawyers, argued that the king was constitutionally immune from prosecution for actions taken before the constitution was suspended and that the charges were politically motivated. Despite these arguments, the atmosphere in Paris was hostile, with the radical press and public demonstrations calling for the king's death. The war with Austria and Prussia was going badly for France at that time, and many revolutionaries feared that sparing the king would encourage foreign powers to restore him and crush the revolution. On January 15, 1793, the convention voted on Louis's guilt. Out of 721 deputies, 693 voted that he was guilty, with none voting outright for acquittal, though some abstained. The next day the convention voted on the sentence. This was the most contentious decision, with deputies speaking passionately on both sides. The Girondins argued for imprisonment or exile, while the Jacobins, led by figures like Robespierre and Saint-Just, demanded immediate execution to remove the threat of monarchy forever. The final vote was incredibly close. 361 deputies voted for death without conditions, 288 for detention or other punishments, and 72 for death with a delay or appeal to the people. The majority for immediate execution was just one vote over the absolute majority required, showing how deeply divided the convention was. Louis was informed of his fate on January 20, 1793. He spent his final night in the Temple prison, receiving the sacraments from his confessor, the Abbé Edgeworth. According to witnesses, he remained composed and resigned to his fate. At around 10 a.m. on January 21, he was taken in a closed carriage to the Place de la Révolution, the former Place Louis XV, where the guillotine had been erected. Thousands of armed National Guards lined the route, both to prevent a rescue attempt and to control the massive crowds. Upon arriving, Louis ascended the scaffold with steady steps. In his final speech, he proclaimed his innocence, stating that he forgave those responsible for his death and prayed that his blood would not fall upon France. His words were quickly drowned out by the beating of drums, ordered to prevent any rallying cries from the crowd. At approximately 10:22 a.m., the blade of the guillotine fell, ending more than 1,000 years of monarchy in France. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, held up the severed head for the crowd to see, prompting shouts of "Vive la République" from many spectators, though others watched in silence or horror. Blood from the scaffold was collected by some in handkerchiefs as macabre souvenirs, a testament to the intense symbolism of the moment. The execution of Louis XVI sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Monarchies everywhere condemned the act as regicide, and foreign powers redoubled their efforts against revolutionary France. The war expanded as Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic joined the coalition against France. Inside the country, the execution hardened political divisions. The Girondins saw the act as excessive and feared it would lead to further instability and radicalization, while the Jacobins viewed it as a necessary step to safeguard the Republic. For the revolutionaries who supported it, the king's death was not merely the punishment of a man but the destruction of a symbol of oppression and the definitive break with the old regime. For opponents, it was a tragic and needless act that pushed France into greater bloodshed. The trial and execution of Louis XVI thus became a defining event of the French Revolution, emblematic of its capacity for both legalistic formality and revolutionary violence, and it set the stage for the turbulent and bloody years of the Reign of Terror that would soon follow. In the aftermath of King Louis XVI's execution in January 1793, France found itself in an increasingly perilous position. The fledgling French Republic faced war on multiple fronts. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic formed coalitions against it, determined to crush the revolution before its radical ideals could spread. Inside France, royalist uprisings and counter-revolutionary movements threatened to undermine the revolutionary government. The most significant of these internal threats emerged in the Valais, a rural region whose deeply religious and monarchist population opposed the new secular and centralized policies. The revolutionary leaders feared that if such insurrections were not crushed, the republic itself would collapse. In this tense environment, paranoia about internal enemies grew, paving the way for the radical measures that came to define the Reign of Terror. At the center of this transformation was Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras and a leading figure in the Jacobin Club. Robespierre believed that virtue was the soul of the republic, but he also held that without terror to defend it, virtue could not survive. His speeches in the National Convention argued that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. The Committee of Public Safety, originally established to coordinate the war effort, gradually assumed near-dictatorial powers. Robespierre, alongside other influential Jacobins such as Georges Danton, Jean-Paul Marat, and later Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, became one of its most prominent members. By mid-1793, the committee controlled military strategy, internal security, economic policy, and even revolutionary justice. The atmosphere in Paris became increasingly charged. The radical sans-culottes, militant working-class Parisians, demanded harsh measures against suspected traitors, hoarders, and profiteers. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, allowed for the arrest of anyone deemed an enemy of liberty or the Republic. This vague definition meant that personal rivalries, neighborhood disputes, or mere rumors could lead to imprisonment. Revolutionary tribunals were established to try these suspects, and trials often ended in quick convictions followed by execution. The guillotine, once seen as a humane and egalitarian method of execution, became a daily spectacle. Public squares echoed with the sound of drums as condemned prisoners were paraded before jeering or solemn crowds. The targets of the terror were diverse. While aristocrats and former royal officials were among the first to be executed, the terror also consumed moderates and radicals alike. The Girondins, once political allies of the Jacobins, fell from power and were accused of conspiring with foreign enemies. Many were executed in the autumn of 1793. Hébertists, radical leftists who pushed for extreme dechristianization and populist economic measures, were also purged when they threatened Robespierre's authority. Even Georges Danton, an early revolutionary hero and once Robespierre's ally, was guillotined in April 1794 after being accused of corruption and counter-revolutionary tendencies. Robespierre justified these actions as necessary to protect the Republic from factions that could destroy it from within. Beyond political purges, the Reign of Terror was also marked by cultural and social upheaval. The revolutionary government pursued a policy of dechristianization, closing churches, removing religious symbols, and replacing Christian holidays with the revolutionary calendar. Some radicals promoted the cult of reason, an atheistic belief system that glorified Enlightenment values, while Robespierre himself introduced the cult of the Supreme Being, a deistic religion meant to instill civic morality without traditional church structures. Festivals and ceremonies celebrated these new ideals, but they often alienated devout citizens, particularly in rural areas where Catholic faith remained strong. Economically, the government tried to address shortages and inflation through price controls and requisitioning of grain. The law of the maximum set limits on prices and wages, but it created black markets and resentment among merchants and farmers. Still, the Jacobins justified these policies as necessary to feed the armies and urban poor during wartime. Meanwhile, France's military fortunes improved significantly. Revolutionary armies, fueled by mass conscription and nationalist fervor, repelled foreign invaders and began to push beyond France's borders. These victories, however, did not lessen the government's reliance on terror. In Robespierre's view, the war's success only heightened the need for vigilance against internal enemies who might sabotage the revolution. By the spring of 1794, Robespierre's dominance in the Committee of Public Safety was nearly absolute, but his power also made him many enemies. His insistence on moral purity and his willingness to denounce former allies created an atmosphere of fear even among revolutionaries. The so-called Great Terror of June and July 1794 saw an increase in executions, with revolutionary tribunals speeding through cases with minimal evidence or defense. Robespierre's Festival of the Supreme Being in June 1794, meant to unite citizens under a moral and civic religion, backfired politically. Many saw it as evidence of his personal vanity and authoritarian tendencies. Tensions reached a breaking point in late July 1794. Members of the National Convention, fearing that they might be Robespierre's next victims, conspired to bring him down. On 9 Thermidor Year 2, July 27, 1794, Robespierre and his allies were arrested after a tense standoff in the convention. The following day, without a trial, they were guillotined. The fall of Robespierre marked the end of the Reign of Terror. Thousands of prisoners were released, the revolutionary tribunals were scaled back, and the political atmosphere in Paris shifted toward moderation. The legacy of the Reign of Terror remains controversial. To some, it was a grim but necessary response to the unprecedented dangers facing the Republic, a ruthless defense of revolutionary ideals in a time of existential crisis. To others, it was an era of tyranny and paranoia, where the revolution consumed its own children and betrayed its promise of liberty. What is certain is that the terror left deep scars on French society. It demonstrated the capacity of revolutionary zeal to slip into authoritarian violence and underscored the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of a few. The guillotine, once a symbol of justice, became a lasting reminder of how the pursuit of political purity can lead to mass bloodshed. The outbreak of war in 1792 marked a turning point in the French Revolution, as domestic political upheaval merged with an international conflict that would last for decades. The revolution had already transformed France's political landscape, dethroning the monarchy in all but name and proclaiming the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These radical changes alarmed the monarchies of Europe, many of whom feared that the revolutionary ideas might spread beyond France's borders and inspire uprisings among their own people. Austria and Prussia, two of the most powerful states in Europe, were particularly concerned. The French royal family's close ties to Austria through Queen Marie Antoinette added a personal dimension to these fears, while the growing instability inside France gave other nations the impression that the country was vulnerable to military intervention. The Legislative Assembly, which replaced the National Constituent Assembly in October 1791, was dominated by increasingly radical factions such as the Girondins. These leaders argued that war would unite the French people, expose royalist conspiracies, and spread revolutionary ideals abroad. They also believed that victory would secure the revolution against internal and external threats. Some radicals even welcomed the idea of foreign monarchies declaring war, convinced that the people of Europe would rise in solidarity with France's revolution once they saw the armies of liberty march into their lands. In contrast, King Louis XVI and his supporters saw the war as a possible opportunity to reverse the revolution. The king quietly hoped that a foreign invasion would crush the revolution and restore him to his former powers. Thus, in a strange twist, both revolutionaries and royalists had reasons to favor war, though for very different ends. In April 1792, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria, marking the start of what would become known as the French Revolutionary Wars. The early stages were disastrous for France. The army, which had been loyal to the monarchy, was deeply affected by the revolution. Many aristocratic officers had emigrated, leaving the military without experienced leadership. The rank-and-file soldiers were often poorly trained, inadequately supplied, and suspicious of their commanders. Discipline broke down, desertions were common, and defeats piled up along the frontiers. The Austrian and Prussian forces, well organized and confident, invaded French territory in the summer of 1792. Panic swept through Paris as the enemy approached. Revolutionary leaders feared that royalist sympathizers within the capital might assist the invaders. This fear contributed to the September massacres, when revolutionary mobs stormed prisons and executed thousands of suspected counter-revolutionaries. At the same time, the war intensified political divisions inside France. The Girondins, who had pushed for war, clashed with the more radical Jacobins, who accused them of failing to manage the crisis effectively. The turning point came at the Battle of Valmy in September 1792. Though militarily indecisive, the battle had enormous symbolic importance. The French army, composed largely of volunteers and inspired by revolutionary fervor, stood its ground against the combined Austrian and Prussian forces. This resistance boosted morale and allowed the revolutionaries to claim that citizen soldiers could defend the revolution against the professional armies of Europe. Just days after Valmy, the newly declared National Convention abolished the monarchy and proclaimed France a republic. The revolution had entered a new phase, one in which war and politics were inseparably linked. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 escalated the conflict dramatically. European monarchies saw the regicide as an attack on the very institution of monarchy, and the war expanded into the First Coalition, which now included Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and several Italian states alongside Austria and Prussia. France faced enemies on all sides as well as revolts at home, most notably the royalist uprising in the Valais region. The war placed immense strain on the French economy, leading to food shortages, inflation, and unrest in the cities. To meet the military challenge, the National Convention decreed a levy en masse in August 1793, calling all able-bodied men to service. This mass mobilization created one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen and demonstrated the revolutionary state's ability to harness the energy of its citizens for war. The revolutionary armies, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, began to score victories. In the north, they pushed back the Austrians and Prussians, retaking lost territory. In the south, they resisted Spanish advances, while in the east, they stabilized the front against Austrian and Piedmontese forces. Revolutionary generals like Lazare Carnot organized logistics and strategy on an unprecedented scale, transforming the French military into a formidable force. This success was due in part to the revolution's willingness to promote officers based on merit rather than aristocratic birth, allowing talented leaders such as Napoleon Bonaparte to rise rapidly through the ranks. However, military triumphs abroad coincided with increased repression at home. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by Robespierre and the Jacobins, used the war as justification for harsh measures against perceived enemies of the revolution. The logic was simple. In a time of national emergency, unity was paramount, and dissent could not be tolerated. The reign of terror intensified, with thousands executed for treason, conspiracy, or insufficient enthusiasm for the revolution. While these measures kept France politically consolidated during the war, they also deepened divisions that would later destabilize the government. By 1794, France had pushed its enemies back beyond its borders and even begun occupying territories in Belgium and the Rhineland. Victories at battles such as Fleurus cemented France's dominance on the battlefield. The revolutionary armies were no longer simply defending the Republic, they were spreading revolutionary ideals across Europe. These conquests alarmed neighboring states, who saw France not only as a political threat but as a power intent on reshaping the entire continent's political order. The war had thus evolved from a defensive struggle into an ideological crusade. The conflict also had a profound impact on French society. Military service brought together men from different regions, breaking down local identities and fostering a sense of national unity. The needs of the army spurred innovations in industry, transportation, and organization, laying the groundwork for France's future as a modern state. At the same time, the human cost was enormous. Tens of thousands died in battle, while disease, poor supply lines, and harsh conditions claimed even more lives. The constant state of mobilization disrupted agriculture and trade, contributing to continuing economic hardship. By the end of the First Coalition in 1797, France stood victorious against nearly all of Europe. The Thermidorian reaction marked a dramatic turning point in the French Revolution, bringing an end to the radical phase dominated by Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins. By mid-1794, France had endured over a year of the Reign of Terror, a period in which tens of thousands had been executed by the guillotine in the name of revolutionary justice. Robespierre, once hailed as the incorruptible defender of liberty, had become increasingly isolated as his rigid moralism, uncompromising policies, and willingness to target both royalists and former allies alike alienated many factions. His emphasis on virtue and his belief that terror was necessary to preserve the Republic had initially found support, but by the summer of 1794, fear and resentment towards his dominance began to grow among the members of the National Convention. The military situation in France had improved significantly by this time. Victories against foreign enemies, especially at the Battle of Fleurus in June 1794, reduced the immediate threat of invasion that had been used to justify extraordinary measures of repression. With the external crisis easing, many in the government questioned the need for continued harsh domestic policies. However, Robespierre showed no intention of loosening his grip. In his speeches, he spoke of rooting out corruption and purging the enemies of the revolution, hinting that even members of the convention were not beyond suspicion. These veiled threats only deepened the sense of danger felt by his political opponents. The political climate in Paris was tense and volatile. The radical Jacobin faction still controlled the powerful Committee of Public Safety, with Robespierre at its head, but other revolutionaries, many of whom had been instrumental in earlier phases of the revolution, began forming alliances against him. Some feared that they might be the next victims of his purges, while others simply wished to end the oppressive atmosphere that pervaded the capital. At the same time, the public mood was shifting. After years of executions, food shortages, and the suppression of dissent, ordinary citizens were growing weary of constant fear. The breaking point came in late July 1794, during the month of Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar. On 8 Thermidor, July 26, Robespierre delivered a speech to the National Convention that was both accusatory and vague, denouncing unnamed members as traitors to the revolution. His refusal to specify who these traitors were enraged many deputies, who feared that they were being marked for elimination. The following day, 9 Thermidor, July 27, Robespierre attempted to speak again, but his opponents shouted him down. The convention, led by figures like Tallien and Billaud Varennes, declared him and several of his allies, Saint-Just, Couthon, and others, outlaws. The arrest of Robespierre did not go smoothly. Supporters in the Paris Commune attempted to free him, and for a brief time he found refuge in the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris. However, the convention's forces moved quickly, surrounding the building and dispersing the resistance. In the early hours of 10 Thermidor, Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, and Couthon were captured. Robespierre had suffered a severe jaw injury, either from a failed suicide attempt or during the chaos of his arrest. Later that day, Robespierre and 21 of his closest allies were taken to the guillotine without trial, a grim irony for a man who had so often defended the necessity of summary executions. As the blade fell on Robespierre, the crowd reportedly erupted in cheers. His death symbolized the end of the most radical phase of the French Revolution and the dismantling of the machinery of terror. In the weeks and months following his execution, the Thermidorian reaction unfolded in full. The Jacobin Club was closed, and many of its members were arrested or executed. The power of the Committee of Public Safety was sharply reduced, and a new political atmosphere emerged, one that was more conservative and less inclined toward mass executions. Prisoners accused of counter-revolutionary activities were released, and censorship eased, allowing for a revival of political discussion. The sans-culottes, the radical working-class supporters of the Jacobins, found their influence greatly diminished as the government turned against them. Economically, the Thermidorian period saw the removal of price controls, which had been imposed during the radical phase to keep bread affordable. This led to sharp increases in food prices, causing hardship among the poor, but the government was more concerned with protecting property rights and stabilizing the currency than with maintaining revolutionary economic measures. Politically, the convention began to draft a new constitution, which would eventually establish the Directory, a 5-member executive body designed to prevent the concentration of power in a single individual or faction. The fall of Robespierre also marked a cultural shift. Public festivals celebrating revolutionary virtue declined, and the cult of the Supreme Being, a deist religion promoted by Robespierre, was abandoned. The mood in Paris moved away from fervent idealism toward a more pragmatic, and at times cynical, approach to governance. While political violence did not disappear entirely, it was no longer wielded with the same ideological fervor that had characterized the Reign of Terror. In the long view, the Thermidorian reaction was not simply a rejection of Robespierre, but a rejection of the political extremism that had come to dominate the revolution. It was a moment when revolutionaries decided that survival and stability outweighed the pursuit of an uncompromising vision of virtue. However, it also signaled the weakening of the radical social reforms that had briefly taken root, as more moderate and wealthy elements regained control. By the time the Directory came to power in 1795, the French Revolution had entered a new, more conservative phase. The ideals of liberty and equality remained part of the political language, but they were tempered by the realities of governance and the desire to avoid another descent into terror. The Thermidorian reaction thus stands as both an end and a beginning, closing the chapter on Robespierre's radical experiment and opening the way for a new, though still unstable, political order in revolutionary France. After the dramatic fall of Robespierre in July 1794, France entered a new phase of the revolution, one defined less by the idealism and terror of the previous years and more by political maneuvering, corruption, and persistent instability. The Thermidorian reaction had dismantled the radical machinery of the Jacobin government, leading to the closing of the Jacobin Club, the release of many political prisoners, and a general relaxation of the harsh censorship and policing that had characterized the Reign of Terror. However, the problems facing the nation had not disappeared. France was still at war with much of Europe, inflation was rampant, and the question of who should hold power remained unresolved. Into this atmosphere stepped the Directory, a new form of government established by the Constitution of Year III, adopted in 1795. The Constitution of Year III was designed to prevent the concentration of power that had allowed Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety to dominate the revolution. Instead of a single legislative body, the new system featured 2 chambers: the Council of 500, which proposed laws, and the Council of Ancients, which either approved or rejected them. Executive power was placed in the hands of 5 directors, chosen by the legislature, who would serve for 5 years, with 1 director replaced each year. This separation of powers was meant to provide stability, prevent dictatorship, and ensure a balance between revolutionary ideals and political practicality. Yet from the outset, the Directory faced challenges, both from royalists who wished to restore the monarchy and from radical Jacobins who still hoped for a more egalitarian, revolutionary France. Economically, France was still in dire straits. The Revolutionary Wars and years of political upheaval had disrupted trade and agriculture, causing shortages of essential goods, particularly food. Inflation was rampant, and the value of the assignats, the paper currency issued during the Revolution, had plummeted. This economic crisis sparked riots and unrest in Paris and other major cities, as people struggled to afford bread and other necessities. The Directory responded with a mixture of economic reforms and repression. Price controls were lifted, which pleased wealthier merchants and landowners but left the urban poor vulnerable to market fluctuations. At the same time, the government used military force to suppress protests, demonstrating that, despite the end of the Reign of Terror, the revolution was not entering a period of peaceful democracy. Politically, the Directory walked a tightrope between the radical left and the royalist right. In 1795, royalists attempted an uprising in Paris, hoping to restore the monarchy. The Directory called upon military force to defend the government, an event that brought a relatively unknown artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, into the spotlight. On October 5, 1795, Napoleon famously used a whiff of grapeshot to scatter the royalist insurgents, securing the survival of the Directory and marking the beginning of his rapid political and military rise. Yet while royalists posed a threat, so too did radical Jacobins. In 1796, the conspiracy of the equals, led by Gracchus Babeuf, sought to overthrow the Directory and implement a proto-socialist government based on equality of wealth and the abolition of private property. The plot was uncovered, Babeuf was arrested and executed, and the Directory tightened its grip on power, becoming increasingly authoritarian in the name of preserving stability. The Directory's dependence on the military became one of its defining features. France was still engaged in the War of the First Coalition, fighting Austria, Britain, and other European powers. Victories on the battlefield not only secured France's borders but also bolstered the Directory's legitimacy at home. Napoleon's Italian campaign in 1796 to 1797 brought significant territorial gains and a wave of patriotic enthusiasm, but it also shifted the balance of power within France. The more Napoleon triumphed, the more he became an independent political force, admired by the public and the army alike, something that would eventually threaten the very existence of the Directory itself. Despite occasional military successes, the Directory's domestic reputation suffered. Corruption was widespread, with directors and legislators often using their positions for personal gain. Bribery, embezzlement, and profiteering became commonplace, feeding public cynicism. The government manipulated elections to maintain control, annulling results when opposition candidates won too many seats. This erosion of democratic principles alienated both royalists and republicans, leaving the Directory with few genuine supporters. Furthermore, economic hardship continued, and while the wealthy and middle classes benefited from the new political order, the urban poor and rural peasants saw little improvement in their lives. The instability of the Directory's rule became more evident as time went on. In 1797, the royalist resurgence in elections prompted the coup of 18 Fructidor, in which the directors, with military backing, purged royalist deputies from the legislature and arrested opponents. In 1798 and 1799, Jacobin opposition gained ground, leading to further purges and crackdowns. This constant political infighting eroded any hope for long-term stability and made it clear that the revolutionary experiment had entered a new phase, one dominated by opportunism rather than ideology. By 1799, France was exhausted by years of revolution, war, and political chaos. The Directory's authority was fragile, propped up by military victories abroad but undermined by corruption, repression, and public discontent at home. The stage was set for a dramatic change, and when Napoleon returned from his Egyptian campaign in November 1799, he found a government ripe for overthrow. In the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon, with the support of key political and military figures, dismantled the Directory and replaced it with the Consulate, marking the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of his own rule. In retrospect, the Directory was a transitional government, born out of the desire to prevent another reign of terror, yet plagued by the same instability and power struggles that had haunted revolutionary France from the start. It failed to resolve the deep economic and social problems of the nation, and its reliance on the military would prove to be its undoing. While it managed to keep both monarchy and radical democracy at bay for a few years, its corruption and inefficiency left it vulnerable to the ambitions of a rising general whose name would soon dominate Europe. After years of political chaos, military campaigns, and shifting governments, France in the late 1790s was a nation exhausted yet still yearning for stability and direction. The Directory, the ruling five-man executive established after the fall of Robespierre, was struggling to maintain control. Corruption was rampant, economic problems persisted, and political factions on both the left and right threatened to destabilize the government at every turn. In this environment, many French citizens began to look for a strong leader who could bring order, protect the gains of the revolution, and restore France's position as a dominant power in Europe. It was during this time that a relatively young but already famous general named Napoleon Bonaparte began his rise to prominence. Napoleon's early military career had been marked by rapid success. Born in Corsica in 1769, he had attended military school in mainland France and quickly demonstrated exceptional talent as an artillery officer. His breakthrough came during the siege of Toulon in 1793, when he played a decisive role in retaking the city from royalist forces supported by the British. This earned him a promotion to brigadier general at the age of just 24. Over the next few years he continued to distinguish himself in the Italian campaigns, where his innovative strategies and ability to inspire troops led to a series of stunning victories over Austria and its allies. These successes not only expanded France's influence in Europe but also made Napoleon a national hero. Despite these military triumphs, the Directory remained unpopular and ineffective. Inflation was high, unemployment persisted, and France's wars required enormous resources. The government's reliance on military conquest to finance itself created a dangerous dependency on its generals. Napoleon, already one of the most celebrated figures in the country, realized that the political weakness of the Directory presented him with an opportunity. In 1798, he launched a bold expedition to Egypt, aiming to strike at British trade routes to India and expand French influence in the Middle East. Although the campaign was mixed in results, marked by both the famous victory at the Battle of the Pyramids and the disastrous loss of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, it further cemented his reputation as a daring and ambitious leader. While Napoleon was in Egypt, the situation in Paris worsened. Political instability, economic decline, and the constant threat of foreign invasion made the Directory deeply unpopular. Various factions, including royalists who wanted the monarchy restored and Jacobins who desired a return to radical revolutionary policies, were vying for control. The ruling directors feared that without decisive action, France could collapse into civil war or fall prey to foreign powers. It was in this tense atmosphere that Napoleon, sensing his moment had come, returned to France in October 1799. Upon his return, Napoleon found that several influential politicians, including Emmanuel Size, a key figure from the early revolution, were planning to overthrow the Directory. They needed a popular and capable figure to lead the coup, and Napoleon was the perfect choice. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire by the revolutionary calendar, he and his allies moved to dissolve the Directory. The coup was not without resistance. Some members of the legislature initially opposed the takeover, but Napoleon used his prestige, military backing and political skill to force the resignation of the directors and push through a new government. The result was the establishment of the consulate, with Napoleon as first consul, effectively making him the leader of France. Officially, the consulate was meant to preserve the ideals of the revolution, but in practice, it concentrated power in Napoleon's hands. Over the next few years, he worked to stabilize the country through a series of reforms. He restructured the government, overhauled the legal system with the Napoleonic Code, improved infrastructure, and signed the Concordat of 1801 with the Pope to reconcile relations between the Catholic Church and the French state. These measures brought a degree of stability and order that had been missing since 1789. Napoleon also continued to focus on military campaigns, defending and expanding France's territories. In 1800, he led the French army across the Alps in a daring move that culminated in the victory at the Battle of Marengo against Austria, securing France's dominance in northern Italy. His military genius and his ability to present himself as the protector of the revolution won him widespread support among the French people. By 1802, Napoleon's power was firmly established. That year, a new constitution made him first consul for life, and 2 years later, in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, symbolizing that his authority came from himself and the people, not from the Pope or any other traditional source of power. This act marked the official end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the Napoleonic Empire. The transformation from revolutionary general to emperor was a remarkable journey. Napoleon managed to preserve some of the key achievements of the revolution, such as legal equality for citizens, the abolition of feudal privileges and merit-based advancement, while creating a centralized and authoritarian state. His rise signaled a shift in French history. The revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity gave way to a new era dominated by the ambitions of a single man. In the eyes of many, Napoleon was the savior of France, a leader who had restored stability, revived the economy, and made the nation a feared power across Europe once again. For others, however, he represented the betrayal of the revolution's democratic promise, replacing one form of authoritarian rule with another. Regardless of perspective, his ascent marked the definitive conclusion of the revolutionary period and the dawn of a new imperial age that would shape Europe for the next decade and beyond.